I listen to XM radio, the 70s channel, and they have this old Casey Kasem show, and so there was a song called Jetliner that Steve Miller sang back in early 1977. One of the lyrics is, you have to go through hell to get to heaven. I think you got to go through hard times to get to your result at the end. And I was reminded, I read something in class, the first session, which you probably don't remember, but I heard it during this retreat I was at, and actually some people liked it enough that it was actually used as a reflection at the beginning of both days of the session. So I apologize for those of you who are non-believers that there is a religious undertone to this, but it says, it's called Patient Trust, and it was a Jesuit philosopher from the last century, Taylor de Chardin. It says, above all, trust in the slow work of God. We are quite naturally impatient in everything that we do, to reach the end without delay. We would like to skip intermediate stages. We're impatient on the way to something that is unknown, something new. And yet, it's the law of progress. And it's always made by passing through some stage of instability. And sometimes that could take a very long time. And so I think it is with you. Your ideas mature gradually. Let them grow. Let them take shape without any undue haste. Don't try to force them on, blah, 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 blah. Okay, and then it gets a lot more spiritual than that. But I mean, learning is the same way, right? I mean, we just kind of want to get to, I want to have the answer. But there's a process. And I was reminded of this. I got on the plane yesterday. I had prepared for class on Monday and Tuesday, knowing that, Wednesday through Friday I couldn't prepare. But I like to come having walked through my script. And so I knew I had to do it on the plane. And, I haven't slept that much. I'm tired. I've, been on a totally different thing. But you gotta let the work flow. So I sat on the plane. I didn't rush it. I felt dozed off for a second, and I got my book out, and I walked through the whole class. And it was a long flight. Something hadn't happened to me in 30 years. We came. They aborted the landing. So you see the runway, and all of a sudden they took back off again. So there was, there were storms around. I think he lost his nerve. He said he wasn't low enough, but whatever. So, but you know what? So, but the more I got into it, the more I started feeling it. And it's the same thing with reading, with preparing for a test, with responding to an RFP, with preparing a case study, with getting ready for a meeting. Okay. It's, I'm going to a meeting. I know everything about it. No, I gotta prepare. I gotta go through hell. Because you want to sound intelligent when you get there, right? You want to. So, the learning process is a difficult one. It requires work, and it requires patience, and it requires a process. And I think I said this one day. One of my friends that coaches at school also said to one of his kids the other day, he goes, like, dude, I'm 59 years old and I'm still learning. So, learning is a process, and it takes time, and it's not easy, but you got to go through it. And I say that because, why do I say that? I don't want to complain all the time, but I got questions from 2 students this week on the first case study. I think I got 1 or 2 questions on the second case study. And again, I got a bunch of people that didn't do case studies. Okay, so don't have to do them, but we're here to learn. So if we don't go through the pain, how are we going to learn? So, I mean, the question I've always asked at the end of the day, and I think I said this in first class, and it's not why you're here, but I'm going to say from my perspective as an instructor, as someone who's looking at the world, not as an academic at a research university, like where I'm on the board, but as a practical, hands-on instructor in a teaching university, at the end of the day, my thought would be the value that a student has gathered from the education here is one that would say to me, I feel comfortable in recommending that person for a job. When somebody calls me and says, I'm looking for an analyst, I'm looking for a junior project manager, you know, I'm looking for, you know, a marketing person, who am I going to send? Who are we going to send as instructors? Who are we going to recommend, right? And so the question becomes, do we recommend folks that are intelligent? I've said to Dr. Forgy, this is the best cohort that I've seen in years. Every one of you is talented in a unique way. Each one of you brings a unique skill set to this class that makes it incredibly, incredibly positive and potentially uplifting to everybody, including the instructor. The one thing I think is missing is effort. It's the hard work. It's going through hell. So you come to class, I appreciate that. You pay attention, I appreciate that. It's time to do the work. And but we'll get to the case study. Frankly, I didn't get a chance to grade the submissions, but I did look at them on my iPad. It was disappointing. Disappointing, the lack of effort for the most part. So we're submitted. I turned it in. I'll get a point. That's not the point here. The point here is to learn, right? So, you know, my question is, I forget the number, or 7 or 8 submissions. What happens when the people who didn't submit have to do a closing at work in a few weeks? How are you going to review them? How are you going to go to your boss and say, send a $20 million in? Or tell yourself, let me call a bank and send my money in. I mean, did we learn? Right? Did we learn? So that's, you know, enough of that. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. So I'm not trying to, I don't want to chastise too much. It's like old people do stuff. So. When I was young and I used to walk to school for 20 miles and my dad was beating me with a tire, you know, I mean, you know, it's, you know, we don't have that. So we had, I think, 1 point open from last week. I don't know, John, did you get a chance?
I did.
He did? Okay, so John's going to give us an update.
It's a
Florida. For a point.
So leases do have to be escrowed. Florida statute 8349. It has to be kept in an interest-bearing account and not commingle with the attorney's funds.
So so lease deposits. Now, are these residential or commercial or just lease in general?
Whenever money is deposited or advanced by a tenant on a rental agreement, a security for performance of the rental agreement, or as advanced rent for other next rental period, the landlord's agent shall hold the amount of such money in a separate non-interest-bearing account in the Florida banking institution for the benefit of the tenant or tenants. The landlord should not commingle such monies with any other funds of the landlord or apothecate, pledge, or any other way make use of such monies until such money is actually due to the landlord. Okay, I'm learning something today that shocks me because I've never seen, and I've never done sort of multifamily stuff in a commercial space. Not that deposits have been a big component of what we've done, because again, if you've got credit tenants, you're not doing the deal because of the deposit. But we've never escrowed, and I don't know anybody does. And you got somebody here going, wow, you know, so yeah, that's frightening. I don't know how much compliance there is with that. But I don't think a lot, because I was doing some review, and they prefer not. A lot of people.
Yeah, a lot of people don't. Yeah. So, but now we know that if we receive deposits under a lease, we must escrow them in an interest-bearing account, and we can't commingle the funds with anything else, and we can't hypothecate it. And thank you very much. Any other open items from last week? No? Okay. Where's the 10-year?
2.08.
2.08. Did it go up? Did it go down?
Still going up.
Interest rate went down.
Okay, I think it was at 2.08 something last week.
Yeah.
And how did it go this week?
It fluctuated, it went up.
It went up, right? It went up. And all of a sudden it went down. We're pretty much where we were last week. So, I mean, you can't measure stuff weekly, but we definitely haven't had any major sort of, changes. And so, again, it's neither good nor bad, but it's an input. And we keep going back. I made the comment the other day that that friend of mine who does acquisitions, he's always, for some time now, he's been a, quote, net seller in his mind. And now he's looking at some deals because cost of debt is so low, right? So, anyway, talking about cost of debt, one of the things that I did come across was an article. This is a little bit dated, but it talks to, or it flows from that conversation we had last week about buying single-family homes and the, sort of relationship between, cash flow and debt service, right? And how that impacts the individual. So this is from and these are national numbers. So we talked about like South Florida numbers the other day. Kind of get the scope from a national number. It says they start by saying the top 5 home builders. Now this last quarter, top 5, bless you. The top 5 home builders in the market realized average third quarter selling prices of homes anywhere from $300,000 all the way to $800,000. So I mean, you've got some home builders, like I think Toll Brothers is one that tends to have higher priced homes, in part because of the geography they're in, and in part because they sell bigger, fancier homes. By contrast, we were saying that the average home price in South Florida was about $350,000, right? So this guy says this is way too fancy for the typical American. It says a multiple of house price to median income of approximately 3.5 would be prudent. Now, I'm going to present it a different way. When I came out of college, you could not get a mortgage if you exceed, I sort of rule of thumb was a quarter of your gross pay or a third of your net pay, okay, was kind of the, now they use these like going in and going out ratios and all that in there. I mean, they're loaning on single family homes upwards of 40% of income. Now, we did an example the other day, or an exercise in class the other day, and I forget the exact numbers, but we kind of came up with like a mortgage and sort of fixed costs or fixed charge for the house of about $2,800, and it was like people had like $3,500 of available income after tax, and that was like 65%. We figured out that didn't work. That 3.5% really works back to about a third rate, a third, right? So it would be prudent to have some, and it says, given a 2017 median household income in this country of $61,000, that would imply a price closer to $215,000. And you're seeing that the big, home builders are selling homes for $300,000 and up, and we're seeing in markets used or secondary market prices going up, well north of $300,000. So it gives rise to public policy and addressing, right? So I didn't get all of it, but in the Journal this morning there was an article about some New York State bill that was passed yesterday dealing with rent control, and it apparently is going to impact over 1 million people just in New York City alone. And so you go back, if there are rent controls on units, what does that imply to values to somebody who owns multifamily?
Rent control goes down.
Well, or you're sort of capped, right? If you buy something, but what's the potential upside if the government is the one that's setting the price for that, right? So I don't want to argue on either side of that. I do realize that my personal preference is to keep the government away from our lives as much as possible. But I also understand that capitalism isn't perfect, and where it doesn't seem to be perfect, and where we seem to continue to hit the wall somewhere is with housing. And it doesn't seem to be just a South Florida issue, it appears to be a national issue. And so stay tuned on that, because I think you're going to continue, especially with the composition of the Democratic contenders in next year's election. I think you're going to start hearing a lot more as the next months go on about housing and making housing more affordable, and initiatives that the government can take to facilitate you know that. So whether, you know, and then I'm sure people will be competing on how far out on what I want to say the left, right, or progressive if you want to make it sound better, people can become, right, people can become in formulating solutions to what is definitely a housing problem, okay? I didn't cut out a lot of stuff. I mean, I read all of my newsletters, but I didn't really have a printer available, so I'm going to skip through some of those. And we got enough stuff to go through, but I'll talk about this one in a second. Knowledge is a driving force that puts creative passion to work. Knowledge is the driving force that puts creative passion to work. So we can be creative, but if we don't have knowledge, you know, how do we put it? And again, I'm going back to the original sort of dissertation here. You gotta work, right? You gotta work. I learned something the other day. So I was at a work group with the president of the university, and he said something that was totally eye-opening to me. And I'm going to equate it to, what did I say? Very simple. What did I say the business of commercial banks was in this country? Taking deposits and loaning money. Very simple. Take deposits and loan money. Well, I didn't realize the business of education. What is the business of education? And in particular, I mean, he focused it in the words he uses at Fordham. But he said, we're in the business of gathering wisdom and disseminating knowledge. So, you know, you look at a university as that. We want to gather wisdom and disseminate knowledge. Okay, so, I don't know, just food for thought, for whatever it's worth. Now, out of The Economist this week, I pulled, does anybody remember the name of the guy who gave us the double entry system of accounting?
Oh, Italian guy.
An Italian guy, Luca Pacioli. So, kind of interesting, there's an article on him in this week's Economist. And I didn't know much about him, but he talks about modern, as a lot of the things that we have, it says modern capitalism really owes a lot to the early Renaissance. And so, I mean, we talk about art. So, I don't want, it's not a history class, right? But we went through like these dark ages, right? And then, you know, and then the Middle Ages. And then as we came out of the Middle Ages, we had this new birth, this Renaissance, right? And so, there was a guy named Antonio de Rompiazzi, and he's the guy, he hired Luca Pacioli to tutor his 3 kids. So the guy went on teaching for a while, and he says, being a good humanist that he was, for 30 years, he attempted to gather all of the world's knowledge of a particular subject into one volume. And so he published something called Summa de Aritmetica Geometrica Proporzioni y Proporzionitale. Whatever, proportionality, okay? So this book was revolutionary on more than one account. It brought integrated computation using Hindu Arabic numbers, you know, combined with a classic Greek geometry. It was written in the vernacular of the marketplace, not in Latin. And it circulated in large numbers thanks to the printing press. You know, so all these new things are happening, right? And all that. But it said, yet the greatest significance in the book lay in a slim how-to chapter that described the double-entry accounting system used by the Venetian merchants. With examples from dealers in butter and lemon and silk, Pacioli set out the method for tracking income and expenses and calculating net profit and losses. So that at the end, for the first time, someone was allowed an immediate snapshot into a company's financial results and position. And so that this brief section would facilitate the birth of the modern corporation. Without order, there is chaos, said Pacioli, okay? He wrote the accounting chapter to help would-be traders in Venice, which was then the capital of the financial world, to sleep easily at night. Without the double-entry bookkeeping system, their minds would keep them awake with worry. So there were 1,000 editions of this book published. There's apparently still 120 out there. Which is why this thing is, somebody's paying $1 million. That's what we're expecting in an auction this week at Christie's. But what I did not know, it said, eventually Leonardo da Vinci convinced his patron, Lodovico Sforza, to hire Pacioli to teach at the court of Milan. And it says Pacioli and Leonardo collaborated on the treatise Divina Proporzione, which married math and art to the study of perspective. Blah, 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 blah. So, anyway, learned something new. But so this guy writes his book, and it's all about math, but, ultimately, 6, 7 centuries later, we're still using this stuff, right? And it's helpful.
So this time period where women and Leonardo they were all living. That was the Renaissance.
Yeah. So yeah. And all these Botticelli and all these people that like artists and craftsmen, and so there was this whole reawakening, and going back, people don't realize, and I'm not a historian. I wish I knew more about this. Curiously, at that time, the Moors had still, invaded. They were still occupying a significant chunk of Spain. And really, what happened with Islam, when Islam spread, a lot of what was lost in Europe was eventually brought back into Europe because it was kept by the Moors. So that Islamic push up across across the Maghreb up into the Iberian Peninsula kept a lot of this knowledge that had been lost from the Greek and Italians, and so a lot of that Renaissance really comes back to what was kept in Spain. So anyway, but like with all things, the Italians get did you know that like 90% of Italian olive oil comes out of Spain and Greece, but it's marketed by the Italians? Stuff like that. They're really good at marketing, and those guys are, all beautiful and flashy and all that. But there's no substance to them, I mean, they can look ridiculous, but they sort of get by, I don't know, whatever. So I'm just thinking like the soccer player guys. Anyway, so. Retail real estate. This is from earlier in the week, and I thought this was an interesting one. We talked the other day about there were something like 7,000 retail establishments closing in the country this year. And that's something to keep an eye on. I didn't realize that 2,100 of them are Payless stores. So I guess we're going to have to pay more, right? Yeah. So no. So but yeah, I know it's a bad joke. Sorry. It was bad. Oh, it's a dad joke? Okay, well, the dad, whatever. Now, what I didn't realize, though, is there are 3,000 new store openings that have been announced already this year. So as much as you've got 7,000 going out the door, you got 3,000 coming in. And it seems like the bulk of those are in discount chains. So like Dollar General is 1,000 of them. And then it goes through some other ones. I don't know, those Family Tree and Aldi and stuff like that. So stuff's always happening. And so we have to read this, right? Because we have to understand what's happening in the world. So when we develop and we're looking down the line, we understand what we want to develop to, and who are the tenants that we should be thinking about, right? So for a long time we talked. Like really a great grocery-anchored shopping center that would give me great credit and all that would be Publix. Well, maybe we've got to start thinking that maybe Aldi, or we don't have Lidl's in this country. It's the same sort of. It's like Aldi, just even more downstream than that. But they're solid. I believe they are solid financial companies. They're German. They're worldwide. And maybe people don't care about the packaging, I mean, I think Lidl, you go and you kind of get like, it's kind of like a crude Costco or BJ's or whatever, You're like, you take your pallet and you just throw bulk stuff in there, And so, for money, people will do stuff, right? I flew to New York Wednesday. I flew back yesterday. There was not a seat available on the plane. So we all bitch. We're cramped. People coughing, whatever. But you know what? It cost me $300 to go up and back, and 35 years ago, it cost me $600 to go up there. When I went to school. So, for the right price, we do anything. And so that's going to impact people's. When we went to the zoo the other day, I saw it at a gas station. I hadn't seen one. There was one of these UPS. locker, like drop-off things. So, you know, it's like, okay, I guess if I buy stuff from Amazon, I'm happy to go pick it up somewhere, you know? I would have never done this before. I've bought 2 things now in the last couple of weeks for my boat, where I couldn't get them locally, I couldn't get them on Amazon, I bought them at West Marine, but because it costs to ship, they give you an option to pick it up free at the store. I went to pick it up at the store, you know, they call you. So, you know, my habits are changing, and I'm sure your habits are changing, you know? So, you just gotta track that. You gotta understand what preferences are, right? And ultimately, we can develop it. And that's happening in, so if people are shopping differently, right? Maybe there's not gonna be as much footprint for foot traffic, but then there may be more need for distribution space, right? Call center space, customer service space, right? And we're thinking of offices. You know, one of the things, here's a curious, and I'll jump into this one. If you want to buy, in the investment sales space in this country, there are 3 or 4 firms that dominate the space as intermediaries. Do we know who intermediaries? Do we know who they are? Who are the large intermediaries in investment sales in this country?
CBRE, JLL.
Okay, so CBRE is a large commercial brokerage operation. The bulk of their focus is really leasing, but they do a fair amount, especially in certain markets and in certain asset classes. They've got an expertise in investment sales. So CBRE would be one of them. JLL, the old Jones Lang LaSalle, is another one. Again, large component of leasing activity, worldwide firms, but they've also got, and they're probably more active in, historically, and that's going to change now, but they've historically been active in office probably more than anything else as investment sales. What other intermediaries are there? There's 2 big ones out there we haven't mentioned.
HFF, Cushman.
Insurance companies?
No, but I want names of companies.
Oh, we want names, sorry.
So Cushman's another one of the large integrated, primarily commercial leasing brokerages. They also in certain markets have a strength. They're probably more office, some industrial, okay? But so there are some investment sales guys at Cushman, but you know, they're not the biggest there. Right? CBRE and JLL would probably be a little bit bigger in that space. Big company, very reputable, but there's 2 big ones out there we haven't mentioned. One is HFF, which is Holiday Finoglio Fowler, and it's a publicly traded company. They've got an operation. In fact, one of the founding offices was here in Miami. They've now just announced that they're being acquired by JLL, so they are going to become, essentially going to take over the capital markets group of Jones Lang LaSalle. But that's a go-to firm. You're looking for product, you're looking to sell your product, those are people to go to. Office, industrial, hospitality, retail. They also do, you know, help you with, I'm gonna call it mortgage banking, so they can source capital, they can source debt, but more importantly, they can source capital. They can find or help you find joint venture partners for deals. Okay?
It says source debt. It says source debt.
Yeah. So they're mortgage bankers. So they can go out there and, you know, so you need $50 million for, you know, an acquisition. They'll be your mortgage banker. You know, they'll go out there and look for institutions, the insurance companies, the banks that, you know, should hopefully provide, you know, the product, you know, that you're looking for, that you fit your particular acquisition. So HFF is one of them. Who's the other one?
It starts with an S and it's a gallery of people.
It starts with an S, and I wasn't thinking of that one.
Okay. I'm having like a total brain card.
Okay. Well, the other one, and it was in the Wall Street Journal this week, is a firm called Eastdil.
Oh.
And Eastdil, for years, has been a subsidiary of Wells Fargo. So they haven't been that active here in Florida. They're a New York-based firm. I like the HFF guys a lot. Eastdil guys, to me, were always very odd. But they've always done the big deals. And so when you look at the article, you see that, you know, all the big Blackstone acquisitions, office equity, Hilton Hotels, the big GE portfolio, real estate portfolio, GE Capital portfolio, Eastdil has essentially brokered. And the reason I bring it up is just they are now, management is buying the business out from Wells Fargo. So they're, you know, with a couple of private equity groups. And again, I don't know if these guys are right or not, but they're saying that they need to be freed from, the whole regulatory environment of being under a commercial bank, which kind of makes sense. But the reason they say that is because they see such a changing landscape in real estate. And so they said, for example, look, WeWork is a huge problem for us. And it's to a large extent, WeWork, and I hadn't thought of this, WeWork is disrupting the whole brokerage commission space. Because a lot of businesses are no longer going to a broker, to a tenant rep or to a landlord rep to do a deal. Just go to WeWork. And part of WeWork's business is not just renting your space, it's really being the broker. I hadn't really looked at it that way. But there was an interesting comment here, and I hadn't really thought about this. And it said, so, co-working firms are offering leasing, property management, other corporate services. But listen to this, and I think this is what's right. So there's been a bunch of people out there that, there's like LoopNet, and now there's this Brevitas. There's been sort of digital attempts at putting buyers and sellers together. CoStar has provided information. Nobody's ever really been able to disintermediate that whole commercial brokerage space. But they said big tech firms like Alphabet's Google and Microsoft may be moving into these businesses in the future. And I just stopped for a second. If Google is taking on autonomous driving vehicles, for example, I mean, how many billions of dollars of real estate commissions don't get paid out there? What's going to prevent a firm like that, or Microsoft, right, to go out there and all of a sudden automate the intermediation process to do that? I mean, really, at the end of the day, whoever thought, well, how can we book airline tickets without a travel agent,
Yeah.
right? How can we gamble without going to the track, right? How can we place a stock trade without going to a stockbroker? Oh, I could never lease space without going to a broker. Well, the technology's there to do it.
Yeah.
And if you stop to think about all of the, virtual reality and ability to, imagine a large national business that has a real estate operation where you're leasing spaces all over the country and you got to hire brokers. You can probably centralize a lot of that stuff and do 99% of the work without ever leaving your office from a technological perspective. Viewing the space, right? Negotiating. So, regardless of where you are in the business, you always have to take a look at what's happening in the world outside you. Because it's changing, and if you don't change with it, you're going to die. Okay, so anyway. The last thing I wanted to cover on that ground was, not on that ground, but I found this note, and I used to use this, and I think it's important to keep an eye on. When we read financial statements, and so we've gone, we kind of like did a little case study to try to put together a balance sheet and an income statement, did journal entries and kind of built up the financial statements. We took a look at a home builder's balance sheet and income statement. We looked at the whole annual report and tried to understand how that all came together. We looked at supplemental reports and tried to do some financial analysis and try to understand some of the metrics in operation. But the thing that is, whenever financial information is presented to you, one has to look at it with a skeptical view or skeptical eye. And the particular genesis of these notes that I put together at the time was, a couple years ago, an article that I read that said 88% of companies, publicly traded companies today, are reporting net income on something other than a GAAP basis. In other words, when every quarter companies report their earnings, everybody's saying as adjusted. And so, I've kind of talked about this a little bit, but we typically have, and again, in a very sort of, can you all see here on this side? I'm going to hopefully do something there in a second, but, a very typical income statement would have sales, subtracted by some sort of cost of goods sold or cost of sales to give us what we call a gross margin or a gross profit. And then from that, we would subtract some sort of selling, general, and administrative expenses, okay? Now this is the way accountants present information. Finance people might have depreciation somewhere else. We typically embed depreciation inside these numbers. So sometimes you hear people talk about EBITDA, EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Those are measures of cash flow, but income statements ultimately work down to net income. They don't work to cash flow. So we don't really present EBITDA information as the way we would present financial statements. So here we would get to some sort of EBIT number, okay? Earnings before interest and taxes. So we would typically take interest out of that, right? And so we would get to EBT. And typically that's where we would then typically just have taxes, okay? And arrive at net income, right? And you probably noticed that every time we subtotal to something, I put one line. And when we total something, we put two lines, okay? That's just accounting code for knowing full stop, period, right? It's kind of like comma, period, right? Subtotal, double underscores a total. But we do, as accountants, at times have things that, I forget the moniker we used to use, but if you've got discontinued operations, you would typically exclude those from your normal operations, okay? If you have errors from previous periods, you would correct them here. Now, we never have errors. We never have errors. We can't admit we have errors, so you rarely see those, okay? But if you have errors, you would, from a previous period, you could put them there as long as they're not material, right? Something which we call the cumulative changes, or the effect of the cumulative changes on accounting estimates that we would use. So all of a sudden, you're a railroad company, you amortize or depreciate your rolling stock over 30 years, and all of a sudden you determine that it's really 40 years. You have to show that you've got some sort of change, okay? And so you would have the cumulative effect of changes in estimates, okay? And finally, the last thing that we would have is something that we would call one-off, you know, or one-time items, right? So the sort of operative terminology here is that they would be unusual and infrequent, right? And so historically, in theory, you never saw anything there. But what's happening now, every quarter when companies publish stuff, there's all kinds of stuff down here. Because what they're trying to tell you is really, the net income isn't what we're telling you it is, it's really something else, because we've got all this like infrequent and unusual stuff that's coming out. And I've said this before, if things are infrequent and unusual, how can they happen every quarter? Then they wouldn't be infrequent and unusual. But there's other things we need to keep an eye on and be concerned when we're reading financial statements, okay? So, first one, and this was one of the sections in the Home Builders 10K that you looked at that we didn't focus on that much this time, but we want to talk about something which we call the quality of earnings. Quality, right, of earnings. And that just becomes a lot more important. So quantity is what's the net income, what's the earnings per share. Quality really talks to, like, how solid is that? How sustainable is that? And so one of the things you need to take a look at is the use of estimates and the discretion that management has in the use of estimates. So what do I mean by that? For example, useful life of assets. All of a sudden you can very easily increase net income by increasing the useful life of your assets. You know, one period you're amortizing the assets over 30 years, the next period you say, oh no, they're not really worth 30, they're going to last 40 years. And all of a sudden, when you comparatively look, you have a higher expense in one period than in another. And unless you look at the footnotes in great details, you never realize that. And these are things, listen, people play with this stuff. People play with this stuff. Two areas in working capital that are critical for you when you evaluate a business. Inventories. So one of the things you've got to take a look at is what's the quantity of a company's inventory balance? And essentially, what's the turnover? These are things we talked about the other day. How many times is it rotating during the year? Because two things can happen. If you have a buildup in inventories, not only does it consume working capital, right? It's cash that you're consuming, so it could put a strain on the liquidity of a company, but it could definitely be indication of slowing down or reduced sales trends, right? Which could have impact in future earnings. And it can definitely be something that gives rise to a write-off. Because now the inventory, why is the inventory not rotating? If you're a retailer, is it because, you know, you brought out a bunch of stuff for the season that people don't like? And there's plenty of retailers that have had that issue, and you don't recover from that overnight, because then all these like little teeny bopper stores where you go to buy stuff that's hip, if all of a sudden stuff's not hip, people don't go there anymore. Okay? So you've got that issue, but you've got a write-off issue because you've got obsolete inventory that nobody wants to buy from you. Okay? Yes, Oz.
Okay, so on the inventory note, there was an article that talked about the tariffs that companies are buying inventory now ahead of the tariffs in order to avoid paying the tariffs. So now in a situation like that,
well, maybe you don't have, so maybe you don't have an obsolescence. There may be a reason why a company is bulked up on inventories, right? So, you know, if you're starting to see, again, going back to our industry, you're starting to see a difficulty in obtaining supply. Maybe you're going ahead and buy bulk rock in advance. You know, it's available. Hey, I know I'm going to have road work for the next 3 or 4 years. I'm going to buy 6 months worth of rock to always have here, because we've had periods where we've gone on allocations. Okay, and so you're going ahead, boom, and buy material in advance. So there may be reasons why. I'm just saying these are red flags. Inventories go up, you know, antennas have to go up, okay? What's the cause? Now there may be a good reason, but maybe there's something behind the veneer, right? Along those lines, receivables are another critical one. So you don't get to look at, nowhere in any financial statements does anybody disclose the aging of their receivables, but you can calculate the days sales outstanding. So if a business's sales go up, receivables may go up as well correspondingly. But the question is, does the collection period go up? And that talks to, again, what we talked about the other day when we talked about credit, right? So the question becomes, if the days sales outstanding go up, time brings uncertainty. If somebody doesn't pay you in 30 days, maybe there's not a problem. If somebody doesn't pay you in 60 days, maybe it's starting to smell. If somebody doesn't pay you in 90 days, you got a problem. And that problem's going to be either somebody is unwilling to pay you for some reason, there's a dispute, there's some sort of anger, or they don't have the ability to pay you. Okay, so collectability becomes an issue, okay? This one's one that's very, very difficult. We're going to go into diligence topics as the class goes on, okay? But something to take a look at is deferred maintenance. In other words, is a company investing in maintaining their assets in operating order? And that's one of the easier ways to control expenses. Right, so all of a sudden things go bad, right? Let's think of Nova. All of a sudden Nova loses a bunch of students in the School of Education or whatever. I think that's was that where the impact was? Jeff?
Business and law.
Okay, I heard School of Education, but you know, whatever. Nova loses a bunch of students. Okay, now all of a sudden it's got a cost structure and it doesn't have the revenue stream associated with it. So what's the first thing it does? Well, cut costs. Yeah. So what costs get cut in most businesses most of the first time? Marketing tends to get cut right away in places. Because those are dollars that are very difficult to see a tangible result for. In a lot of businesses, okay? Yeah, I'm not saying, yeah, next you're going to cut some overhead, you're going to cut people, okay? But somewhere up there in the list, it's maintenance. Look, I'm looking at our condo, right? So You know, I'm talking to the guy that does the yard work the other day, and I'm like, dude, you weren't here last week. He goes, no, the board told me that it's every other week. He goes, yeah, but if every other week is 3 weeks, 3 times in a month, they call me and say, don't come. You know, so all of a sudden the grass was a lot higher. Silly example, right? But, you know, hey, you know, and you surely in physical plant have certain recurring items that you do. You know, we service the boiler every 6 months. We service the air conditioner every month. We paint the buildings every 9 years or whatever. And one of the things that gets hit typically is periods of maintenance or frequency of maintenance starts getting pushed back. And I can tell you one of the single biggest in real estate opportunities or threats in an acquisition is taking a look at deferred maintenance. Okay? Where can you add value? In real estate that's got deferred maintenance. The guy hasn't been putting money into the deal, right? All of a sudden you can come in, spruce it up, hopefully generate more revenue, right? You know, conversely, you know, a guy's kept the property pristine, how much value can you add? Now, maybe you've got a nice certainty of income there, you know, and so, you know, going back between core and value, maintenance plays a, you know, big part in how an asset is kept, okay? We talked about revenue recognition in the context of do we have a sale and how much profit should we recognize, but what happens in companies is, and one of the techniques we used to use as auditors, we used to do what was called cutoff testing. So cutoff is the period at which one period ends and the other one begins. So the question becomes is, you know, do we have a lot of late sales? Do we have a lot of sales that occur at the end of a period, right? And so, you know, the question really becomes, and listen, you hear this one all the time. You start to think of, like, the guys that manufacture heavy goods, car manufacturers, what's called channel stuffing, right? They're not meeting their numbers. What do they do at the end of a quarter? They push a bunch of vehicles down to the dealer level, right? I did some work once for, and that business has changed, but a beer distributor down here. And so, you know, beer, going back to Prohibition days and when we came back, brewers couldn't own the distribution channel, and then distribution entities couldn't control more than certain geography and all that. So the brewer had a tremendous amount of discretion. So I remember talking to a guy, and the guy was saying, I asked him, why don't you rep other brands? And he said, oh, no, because I'm piss Anheuser-Busch off. And I said, well, so what? And he goes, so what? He goes, they ship me, so the way they worked is all the cash that's picked up by the drivers gets deposited in an account that's controlled by the brewer, by Anheuser-Busch. They pay themselves, then they send you your bit. But the really important thing is that they ship you whatever the hell they want to ship you. So all of a sudden a rail car shows up, and if you haven't been nice, they sell you a bunch of beer that nobody wants to buy. Okay? So manufacturers, and you see that in a lot of industries, technology, chips, you know, Cisco, all of a sudden, you know, you're a value-added reseller, you may get a bunch of stuff pushed down to you, right? So, you know, at times people may not enforce pay or take contracts, but at other times they're going to force you into it. And so the question, are they really sales? And they may be sales this quarter, but if you've pushed stuff into your channel that there isn't demand for, the next quarter is going to catch up to you. And if not the next quarter, the following quarter, somewhere along the way, right? Because the demand is not in the distribution channel, the demand is at the consumer level, right? So, got to take a look at that, or, you know, and that was a tough one to find. Reversal of previous reserves. As accountants, we cannot create contingencies for unknown items. I talked about FASB 5, and we talked about if there was a known contingency and it was probable, measurable, right, and likely, you had to accrue that contingency. What you can't do is just set up a general reserve. A reserve for a rainy day, you know? Now, I'm telling you that. Now, I'm not telling you that as a CFO of a company, I've always had reserves that I can go to smooth earnings. Okay? Because every CFO has that. You can't do it, but you find ways of, you always want to have something for a rainy day, right? And the problem is a lot of companies out there, you know, exceed that. So what do they do is if you ever notice, it's really strange, if you ever notice it, like, companies' earnings are always sort of very smooth like that. How the hell does that happen? I mean, how does that happen? You know, and a lot of times it's, you know, people have reserves that they can go to, and you know, release, or when you've got too much income, you build it up, and when you need a little bit of juice, you know, you let it go. So there's you know, smoothing over tax rates. I won't get into that, but people play around with, you know, this change in tax law all of a sudden. How much of that net income or earnings per share comes out of this last line, which is totally not operational? It has nothing to do with what the underlying business is all about. Non-recurring items, we talked about that. Non-recurring items. One of the things that happens is all of a sudden you've got a bunch of losses. How do you get rid of them? Boom, you start selling assets. You get these huge gains, and that's, you know, going back into the in the REIT realm. Why do we have FFO? You know, why do we add back gains and sales on assets? Because we want to look at a measure of sustainable or ongoing cash flow, not one time. Okay, so we're, you know, we want to see what the trends are going to look like going into the future. And there's a whole bunch of other ones, but I thought those were kind of the best ones. Now, I had one last thing before we go to the case study from last week, and I got to turn this on.
I got it started. Yeah, try power again. There it is.
Okay.
I was blinking. Here, I'll come back.
Blink? Does that mean it's broken? Do I have to turn this on, maybe? HDMI. Wait, it turned blue. Oh, because I hit this. I'll turn this off. I mean, I can, you know what? I can do it there. It's just a problem. Yeah, let's just put the thing down, because otherwise... Okay, class. Okay, so there were a couple of concepts that I wanted to follow up on from last week, because so we did this credit analysis report case study last week, and I went through sort of a sequence of how I would address on that case, but there were a couple of things that I said, you know what, I'd like to add some techniques to the analysis that some of them may be relevant to this, but I think it's an extension of. They could definitely be helpful tools for you to take going into the future. So I don't like being behind computers, but it's the only way that I can move some of this stuff. So number one, this first scenario was the one that I said, this was a proposal that the broker sent to us, right? As is. Guy wanted to pay $17.50, you know, rent. You know, he wanted 3% bumps. He only wanted 3 years, and he wanted TI of whatever. And we said the best way to look at this was to look at a net present value analysis. And we said, it doesn't work. Got a negative net present value of $3.8 million. Makes no sense. So then I just changed one thing and said, okay, let's change the lease term to 10 years. I don't want to make it too small, but change the lease term to 10 years, really 11, and we kept all things equal, and we said it still doesn't work. So then I said, okay, well let's change another, let's play with another sort of variable. And what I said there was, okay, let's play with the bumps. Let's make the bumps a little bit greater, okay? And then let's change the TI and make it a market TI. And now all of a sudden we came up with a positive net present value. So we're kind of like, okay, so it kind of works. Now, a couple of things I wanted to say on that. Some of you, do you guys use any data tools at all in Excel? Like, do you use GoalSeek, or have you used Solver or anything like that?
I've used Solver.
Okay, well, I'm glad some people use it.
You saw me use it.
I saw you use it, but there's a whole bunch of other people that haven't used it. So, Solver is an add-on that you've got to download into Excel. So if you go to File and Properties, you should be able to download the Solver tool pack. Okay, there's a whole. So, you can download the analysis pack, or the Solver add-in. Okay. And you can like download like euro signs and stuff like that. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can add. Okay, so but you get GoalSeek automatically. You don't have to download that. Okay, so the question I came up with is I was thinking about this. I said, well, what did we say? When should you undertake a capital budgeting decision? When your MPV is what?
Positive.
Positive, better than zero.
Positive. Yeah, I mean, I could almost say at 0, you'd be indifferent, but you could do it because you're getting your cost of equity, your cost of capital repaid. Okay, so let's say greater than 1. So I said, well, what kind of bumps? I mean, you could do this with any one of the scenarios, right? How much TI could I give to go to an MPV of 0? I just use the example saying, well, what kind of bumps do I have to give the guy if I want to have an optimal MPV, right? And what's my optimal MPV? Well, so my optimal MPV should be 0, right? So I use GoalSeek here. All right, I'll play with it right now so you can see how that works, right? I use GoalSeek to say, at what level does my MPV equal 0? Now, we can make it 1, right? So let's just do GoalSeek. So we're going to go, let's set this cell to 1 by changing this cell. Boom. And all of a sudden you see there's a change. I mean, it's very little because it was only $1. Okay? But we can also I can all of a sudden put, let's just put the 3% that we had here, right? Okay, we're at 3%, right? Now, we can also get to the same solution, right, and say, let's play around right now with our TI. So we can say, let's set this cell to 1 by changing my TI. Boom. So I can give up to $45 and still make it a viable solution. So you see the power that Excel has if you sit down and build the plumbing in such a way to be able to play around with that. It says now you can talk with your tenant or your potential tenant. The guy says, "Oh, give me 50." No, I can give you 45 because that works. I can go up to 45. I can't go more than that. Okay. Now I said there's a couple other things I thought we could play with. I said one of the concerns that I had was I wanted to get the market. And we talked about why it was important to get to a market rent. Why was it important to get to a market rent? Because when I sell it, I want to be able to maximize my sales value. And now we're talking about multiples. Now we're just talking about like what drops to the bottom line every year. We're talking about somebody paying me a multiple on the cash flow. So what I did is I just took one line and said, what market we said was 21 in this case. So I said, okay, I'm just gonna grow the 21 by the 3% every year, right? And so I just said, okay, how do I get to 2434 in year 5? You know, by year 5, I think I'm going to sell it. I could do it in year 4, I could do it in year 3, I could do it in year 7. I could do it whenever I want to do it, right? But I want to get to 2434. What kind of bumps do I need to have in my rent in order to do that? And I could use goal seek. Solver allows you to use multiple conditions, okay? I don't think this has Solver downloaded, but let's see if we can quickly do it. I don't know if it's going to let me do it or not. Well, listen, we can do it with goal seek, right? So let's just say that we want to get to market in year 3, okay? So what we want to set is the rental payment as it's structured today to market at the end of year 3, right? So we could use, you know, goal seek again. So we could say, let's set this cell to 22.95 by changing the bumps every year. Okay? And all of a sudden, you got to bump 9.5% every year. So, pretty cool, right? Easy tool, gives you information. Does that make sense? Does that sound? Now, there's one other analysis that I wanted to go through from there. So I just kind of played around and I said, well, I mean, I've got a bunch of different, I did a little grid here, and I just said, you know, I've looked at a bunch of different scenarios, right? And all I did was, you know, I looked at a bunch of different scenarios, and I had, you know, these that have different increases, and I played around with different stuff, right? And I just kind of said, well, all of a sudden, I've been going back and forth with a tenant on a bunch of different alternatives, and I got all these numbers, but I don't know what they mean. How do I ultimately come back and compare one proposal to another? And one of the techniques we use is what we call effective rent, okay? And so basically what we're going to do is come back and say, okay, what's kind of the rent of the stream, okay, if we take out the items that, you know, make us go out of pocket. So what you do is you go out and under the different scenarios, you lay out the cash stream that you've got, okay, with the different bumps in place, okay? Now, I'm summing this way now. That's, those of you did the, I think I've got one in-house, and those of you who looked at the video, when we do development budgets, we add to the left. Not because we're Chinese or Middle Eastern, but because things tend to have a very long life, and we won't look at totals right close. So we cross-foot left, not right, so we don't have to scroll all the way there and figure out what's going on. So if I add my cash flows left, my total rental stream is this, right? I subtract the TIs under each one of the scenarios. That gives me a net cash flow, and I have an undiscounted effective rent. Now I could say, okay, clearly this is, you know, this is the superior option that I had, right? Now, if I hadn't done that, you know, scenario 3, which had the 3.5% bumps, would be the one that, you know, would be up. But, you know, it reduces the discussion or the argument to numbers. It's not, well, I think, I believe, well, I think that one's better. Oh, I can offer you this. What do you have to offer? Okay, I got to have an effective rent that's greater than that, you know. You want to play the variables, you know, oh, well, I'd rather have bumps of this. That's great, but then I got to bring my TI down because otherwise this is still a superior proposal. Okay? Does that make sense? So this is just a way of taking cash streams and sort of summarizing them or finding a way that you can optimize or figure out which one is the optimum solution. Right? So, I mean, I don't want to shortcut through the example all of a sudden. You know, well, I don't want to have 3.5% bumps, but again, I'm just going to shortcut this here, okay? I should do this. I'll say, okay, well, what if I only give you $3 million worth of, you know, TI? It's still not a, you know, okay, what if I give you $2.5 million? Right? Oh, and all of a sudden it's still not good. What if I give you $2 million? Right? Still not good enough. Okay, good. Now, we could also use goal seek, right? So we could say, let's set this value, let's set this value to 19.51, right? By changing that. Boom. I can give 1,887,000. And then I have to start guessing it, you know. Yeah?
How did you learn? Like, is there some kind of course? What course did you take to learn? I mean, obviously,
Excel?
like during the
Like an Excel.
during the course of being a CFO, you pick these things up, but
I learned how to use goal seek from one of the other instructors in this program, believe it or not. And then I started playing around with Solver a lot in a graduate level course that I took on just finance. But I've recommended a book called The Principles of Excel by Simon Benninga.
It's in there?
Bazinga?
It's in there? It's in that book?
He's got like everything in there. But here's something, and I also, look, Aaron, that's a great question, right? So I get all kinds of junk. One of the junk letters that, you know, newsletters, I get a bunch of junk mail from the AICPA, from the American Institute of CPAs. And every month in the Journal of Accountancy, there are Excel tips. So I always look at that article. Most of the time, it's not stuff that, you know, I'm too keen on. But for example, let's see if this one has it already. So I don't think that 365 has it. Okay, so one of the things that it should be in data. One of the maybe it is here. No. Okay, one of the things that Excel does now is it gets you delayed stop quotes. So I saw that in that article, and I'm like, how do you do it? So I went to the Microsoft Help and started playing around with it. And I figured out the add-in that I've got right now, it cost me $10. It's a lot more effective. But one day it's not gonna be, right? So that's one way I played around with it. Another thing that I've done that is really helpful is I actually have sat down, believe it or not, because they're always coming up with, I really just come to functions here, and I start going down and saying, okay, what the hell is this? What's it for? So let's go to one that I may look at in a little bit, right? So I don't know what cumulative interest, you know, is. Cum-I payment. I don't know what that is, but it tells me it returns a cumulative interest paid between two periods. That's interesting. It tells me the syntax, what I have to do. And if I don't know, and I go to help on this function, it's amazing. I mean, Excel is actually really good for this kind of stuff. And this tells you exactly, you know, a lot of times, because I forget stuff, a lot of times I forget, like, I'm going to show you something when I did a couple of things with a case study this time, where you forget, well, sometimes you got to put a negative number because that's the way it works, right? Like when you're doing present value, if you don't put negative payment or negative present value, it doesn't give you the right answer. So stuff like that. So it sort of walks you through it very, very simply. And in the worst, if it looks curious enough, and you haven't figured out how to do it, then go to YouTube and do a search in YouTube, and there's all kinds of crazy people that sit there and tape themselves at night showing people how to do stuff. Like, I don't remember, somewhere in my dark ages, there was something called matrices in math, and I was like, I don't remember that. You know, so when I did this graduate course and we were building, you know, the efficient frontier, you've got to, you know, you got to do these matrices, and then all of a sudden, it's like there's all these functions in Excel for matrices, and I had like no idea like how to do any of this stuff, right?
Equals M molt or something like
Yeah,
that?
like M molt and stuff like that, you know?
There it is.
There you go, right? So, you know, whoa, what the hell is that? You know, this is the matrix, it returns a matrix product of two arrays.
Multiplying
I don't know.
shapes.
So, but it's always helpful, and I'm just telling you, it's kind of like, it's hit or miss, or it's talking to people. Why did I not give students an Excel spreadsheet to do the settlement statement? It's exactly it. I could have given it to you, but I want you to do it yourself. It's only when you mess up that you learn, or when you got to struggle that you learn. Okay, so while we're on that, and we got this up, why don't we just go to the settlement statement? Go to the settlement statement. Yeah? We'll go to the settlement statement. Yeah? Yes? No? You're the boss. I'm the boss. Yeah, well, let's go to the settlement statement then. Thank you. Give the man a star.
Cohen and I left.
Okay. I sent a case study out. As I said earlier, I was disappointed again. I shouldn't be disappointed. You know, you create incentives, and then I definitely learned that incentives do motivate actions. So if you provide tax incentives, people will act in a particular way. If you provide great incentives, people come to class. That's great. I'm happy you're here. Don't put a lot of weight on case studies. People don't do them. Bad. Bad. So I sent some instructions, and I want to go over them. So this is a real case study. This comes from this is the closing statement that this deal was done. It was actually, I requested that we do a combined. The actual closing, we had a seller's statement and we had a buyer's statement, and you know, so I changed the names. It was a 3-building portfolio. It was in Maitland, Florida. And I changed some of the numbers just to make it a little bit easier. But it was a real deal. And I basically just went and grabbed the closing statement, the final closing statement, and wrote the case from it. So maybe I had a little bit more experience, okay? But no, you know, I got to come up with suggested solution sets. And I still found my notes on this one. And I did this on February 6th. I don't know what year. This is probably around 2011 when I brought this case study in. But my notes to me say I started at 2:35. By 2:50, I had finished gathering the facts. That's one of the things I said. There's shit everywhere. Sorry. There's junk everywhere. And what I suggested was go through and start building silos. Build buckets. Okay? So about 15 minutes to create the buckets. And by 4:30 I was done. So it took me 2 hours to do this. It really, as I looked at it on the plane yesterday again, I said, you know what? This really is very, very easy. It really is very, very easy case. I was disappointed and again, I don't want to, I'm glad the ones who did it, but my cursory review on the submissions, there was stuff that really wasn't thought out through. You know, a lot of times it's kind of like, although it was too confusing. And I'll give you an example of something that was disappointing. This case had an original loan of $21,500,000. $21,500,000. I had 4 or 5 submissions where the loan wasn't amortized. 3 years had gone by. So on a closing statement, somebody's getting a credit for $21,500,000, not charged for $21,500,000. No, like no amortization at all. So there's also value. So there's value in reading something and not doing it and putting it aside. Read it, put it aside. Coming back, grouping stuff, working, focus, without the phone on, without the text going, without the chats, without the Instagram, without the likes, okay? Without the Game of Thunder or Drones or whatever, whatever TV show is. I don't know. Is that a TV show?
But it's.
I don't know. I am divorced from pop culture. Okay. Focus on what you're doing. Focus. Okay. And when you do the work, put it aside again, and don't submit it till you review it. How many times do we send an email that we haven't read? And then we read it after we hit send, and it was like an auto spell thing, and it puts the word that just totally messed, you know, and that happens with text all the time, right? Because what's the fat finger? We just want to hit send, right? So, you know, towards that end, here's the case. Here's the case. It's very simple. We have a closing statement. There's a buyer, there's a seller. The building sells for $40 million, give or take. Give or take. The buyer, give or take, puts in $20 million, roughly, and is going to assume a mortgage of about $20 million. Does he have to come up with a lot of cash to close? Probably not. Now, most of the people that submitted didn't even have a total at the bottom, which is what you're solving to. How much cash do you got to put in to close? And the seller, how much cash are you getting out of the deal? Right? So if when you do your case, when you do your settlement statement, if just at a very macro level, you're not close to zero cash due from the buyer, you've missed the boat.
I missed the boat.
And if you're the seller and you're selling a building for $40 million bucks, and you're going to be relieved of a mortgage that's about $20 million bucks, you better be getting about $20 million bucks at closing. And if you're not, you missed something along the way. But that's how simple the case is. Now, yeah, you want to get exactly what you're due, and we've got proration and stuff like that we got to worry about. But at a very macro level, the buyer's assuming a $20 million loan, and he's put in $20 million. He doesn't have to come up with any more, and the seller's going to be looking for something close to $20 million bucks because he sold the building for 40, and all he's given up a $20 million loan, and he wants his money. So that's where we're starting. We should be somewhere near there. Now, we start by aggregating thoughts. As I said, the way life works is some woman or some guy in some escrow office somewhere sending you emails with these closing statements asking you to approve them. You probably never met that person. You may not even have spoken to them. Where do you get the information from? There's stuff flying all over the place. Attorneys are sending you stuff. Your development people are sending you stuff. You got all these vendors sending you stuff. The lender's attorney sending you this. The lender's sending you this. And all this stuff. I was doing multiple closings at one point. I had all these, when this building was going on, I had a bunch of stacks in my office. As paper came in, I just started putting it by building so that I could at least sift through it. So when I got I could tick it. I could tick it. Because ultimately, somebody has to sign this. And when you sign it, money goes out the door or money comes in the door. And what you don't want is to let money go out the door that should stay in-house, or you don't want money coming in-house that is deficient in any way. You want every dollar you're entitled to coming your way. So it doesn't matter what side of the equation you're on. When you say, I'm good, it better be good. It's dollars. Okay? First thing you got to do is aggregate all this stuff. So, you know, I took the case, and I actually just took the Word document, and I started grouping stuff. Now, you don't have to group stuff, you don't have to group stuff the way I grouped it, but I tried to follow, so I sent a sample out there. I mean, I said, utilize the attached step, template, and include whatever information you believe is relevant and exclude whatever items are extraneous. So, if there's no loans 2, 3, or 4, don't put lines that aren't there. Don't just copy the form. Tailor the form. So, I put stuff that was sort of property, buyer, seller together, right? Who's the buyer, who's the seller, how much square footage there is. I immediately took stuff out that was irrelevant. There was a bunch of stuff here that's irrelevant. The VP of Acquisitions and Disposal says you're getting a valuable property. Okay, great. Who cares? That's what you're buying. Transfer taxes in Dade County are X. Well, the building's in Orange County. Forget that. The surface parking ratio is 5.1. Great. That's why you're buying the building. It's got good parking. The rent roll, the tenant roll, the expirations on the leases. Again, part of your evaluation, part of what we're going to look at is part of the diligence process, but not relevant to the closing. Okay? It's in Maitland, you know, market rents are $23.50. Again, an important consideration for diligence and for your decision is to move forward to buy the building or not, but not relevant for the closing. Okay? So, boom, discard that stuff. I gathered all the deposit stuff together. You asked a question, or you should ask a question. Why would you have made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different deposits? This closing dragged on for 3 days. And every day that goes, you got to readjust your prorations. And every day that went on, some other invoice showed up, or another issue showed up, or another problem came out. And the last one is, there's one that comes in, it's very interesting. For those of you who didn't get the answer, lease terms and compliance is summarized in something called an estoppel letter. Okay, what's an estoppel letter?
How much is due by a certain time period?
Well, you're thinking of an estoppel letter that you would get from a bank dealing with a payoff. So when you're paying off a loan, you would go to the bank and ask them for an estoppel letter, and that estoppel letter would say, for you to pay it off on so-and-so date, you would have to pay so much. And for every additional day beyond that, you pay so much interest. What's an estoppel letter in the context of a lease, Brian? You raised your hand.
Yes, from there's no other interested party in the property.
Well, I mean, you may include that. No, so typically, one of the basic conditions that a landlord would include in a lease agreement with a tenant, or try to negotiate with a tenant on a lease, is the inclusion of the obligation of the tenant to provide an estoppel letter if they're ever requested to do that. I'm buying a building from Juanita. She's got 50 tenants in the building. She's got 50 leases. She gives me a document called a rent roll. What's a rent roll? Who the tenants are, when, you know, it's a document that details or summarizes all the conditions of all the leases. In addition to that, she gives me a box and says, here are all the leases. And by the way, we know, I'm not an attorney, John. You guys take legal classes. You've got very intelligent attorneys that teach you these classes. When you sell commercial real estate, leases go along with the property. Right? So you say, here are the leases you're walking into. How do I know that that's the right, all the leases are in there? How do I know she didn't forge them? How do I know that all the amendments and renewals are included in there? How do I know she hasn't fudged the numbers in the rent roll she's given me? And she looks like, look at her face, she has. Okay, no, how do we know that? And the way we know that is we directly go to the tenants and get an estoppel letter from them that says, yes, we are in fact bound by a lease dated on so-and-so date. This is how much rent we pay. This is when their lease is due. And more important than that is any incompliance that you may have. So, I want to show you something later in class regarding a building I took a look at. the building ultimately didn't close because during diligence, one of the issues that came out from an estoppel letter was that a tenant said the landlord is not in compliance with the parking provisions that they've agreed to. So why would you look at parking? Sometimes you oversell parking to your tenants. Sometimes you're not in compliance with municipal or regulations. But a lot of times is, you know, I have a building that can only park 3 to 1, but I promised you 5 spaces and 5 spaces and 5 spaces and 5 spaces. Also, I promised more spaces than, that's one thing that happened. In this particular case, if you saw that there was a $523,000 TI allowance that was due to a tenant, that came from an estoppel letter. The day before closing, we get an estoppel letter. And the seller did not hide this from us. We were ready to close. Because a lot of times, what you'll say, you'll negotiate in a purchase sale agreement, you'll say, look, I want estoppels from 80% of the tenants. Or I want estoppels from these 3 major tenants and half of the other ones. You know, because you're never, I mean, that's like herding cats. Okay, you can never get estoppels. Okay, people just don't want to give them, right? So we were prepared to close on this without getting the estoppel letter from this tenant. And the seller came to us and said, look, we got a problem here. We got this estoppel letter. And what had happened? They had given us the box with all the leases, and there was a 3rd amendment to a lease with some expansion provisions, and the landlord had made a promise to build $523,000 worth of TI on the expansion space. And we didn't know it. But it came out in an estoppel letter. Okay? So stuff like this is flying around all the time. You know? So why did we have all these different, because the numbers kept changing, okay? The numbers kept changing. Then I said, look, this stuff all kind of looks like stuff that's related to, you know, the escrow agent and things that they should be, you know, accumulating. There were copies being made. There were their fees. Okay. There were some doc stamps that they were going to pay related to certain recordings. Okay. And then there were a bunch of issues related to the loan. Okay. And the loan affects both parties here. So there was a loan that was being assumed, so we had to figure out what. We would get an estoppel letter there from the lender to figure out how much was being owed, you know, how much was owed. So how much this guy was relieved and how much this guy was being charged, okay? There were assumption fees. So one of the things that came out, and we didn't talk about this, but when you have securitized debt, what's securitized debt? Securitized debt?
Debt?
That is guaranteed.
Debt that's been secured.
There it is.
That is guaranteed by
No.
some.
So it's grouped and sold to
guaranteed,
investors.
But secured by some kind of.
When we talk about commercial mortgage-backed securities, for example,
Oh, yeah.
we've talked, and I'm not. Didn't I do that one day here? Did I do that in this class?
They don't like to get repaid. Securitized debt.
No,
the thing.
but that's not where I'm going. Look, one of the things that you do to save money at the university is you don't throw away these things when you write on one side. You just flip it over. Okay? So that's why they got all this stuff in the back. Okay, but didn't we go through? You guys, have you not gone through securitization in the finance class? It's in the Brueggemann book. I know that. You just got here.
Yeah.
Do you know what day it is? Okay, I'm not going to go through that right now. Maybe I'll go through that later or tomorrow. But when we talk about CMBSs, when we talk about cash flows that have essentially been converted to securities, right? So let's call it round numbers, $1 trillion worth of commercial debt out there today has been securitized. So a conduit has loaned the money, and then they have packaged that cash flow and sold that in the way of securities to investors. I'll get into that in a second. Maybe I'd like, because I think you guys should know that. It's a big source of equity, of capital in the real estate industry. There are two critical players. Well, there's multiple players in this. There's a trustee, there's a trust that's set up, and so the trustee is paid the money, and then the trustee pays the distributions out to the security holders, okay? But there are two. There is a master servicer, and there is a special servicer. Okay? So the master servicer is a guy that deals with the securities on a day-to-day basis. He makes sure that whatever deposits have been required are there. He makes sure that the insurance and the property taxes are paid. He makes sure the trustee gets paid, and the trustee then sends the money. The special servicer only gets involved when there are special situations. Somebody wants to assume the loan. Somebody wants to defease the loan. Okay? There's a default. Now, to your point, nobody wants this paper back. Nobody wants it. So, but that gets a little bit more complicated in that, because that's a little bit above where I'm at. Special servicers tend to be the guys that buy the last priority piece in the securitization. So they're kind of the most at risk in a way in the event of default, so that's why they want to be in charge, okay? And so there may be times that they actually do want access to the property, okay? But anyway, so that's a guy that's got to approve the assumption. And, all these guys have counsel, and all these guys get fees. Everybody makes fees. So the assumption fees are going to this guy so he can approve the assumption, okay? And there's conditions. The indenture, the bond indenture, is going to tell you under what conditions the loan can be assumed or not, okay? You've got deposits that are there related to the securitized debt, etc. Okay? Then you've got prorations that impact both parties related to revenues and property taxes. Okay? And then you've got some tenant deposits that need to be passed from one guy to another. And then you've got some issues that only relate to the buyer. The buyer hired an intermediary to help them identify the property. They got to pay something. They've got some legal fees they got to pay. And then the seller also has an intermediary that they have to pay something to, and also has some legal fees that they need to pay that are only related to them. And that's it. So now once you got all the stuff in the bucket, all you got to do is fill the bucket. Pretty simple.
I have a question on the property taxes.
Yes, sir. We're going to go through all of them right now.
Perfect.
Yes, tell me, but ask me your question.
So it's like there was reserves by the seller to be transferred to the buyer, and then there was an assessment for $500,000. Is there, what's the process to prorate maybe the assessment?
There was an assessment.
From the 20 whatever year tax assessment.
20-year tax assessment.
It was the year before. There's a tax assessment of $500,000 or so. 2008.
Okay.
And so how does that go with the assumption of the property tax reserves maybe that were transferred? The 350 and then the 500.
So the reserves are essentially to guarantee that there's payment. My understanding would be, I'm a little bit removed from this, my understanding would be that in residential transactions today, you pay monthly into an escrow fund that receives an invoice and pays. In most commercial escrow accounts, they're not going to pay for you. You just put that money aside in the event you don't pay. The invoice comes, you pay it. And then you prove to the servicer that you paid it. It's not a sort of rotating fund like it would be in a residential transaction. So in this particular case, in this particular situation, in most commercial transactions, if you've got deposits that are held with a servicer, right, and a loan is being assumed, you've got to transfer that from seller to buyer, but that's a totally independent situation from the proration that you got to do that a seller owned a building for part of a year, and they're not going to pay the taxes that you pay at the end of the year, so you've got to hold them accountable for the number of days that they own the asset and they generated revenue from it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Two totally different things. Okay, do you guys want to see how I did this? Why not, right? Yeah, so here, well, I'll jump to that one in a second. So this is what I did. I mean, I love playing with Excel, but what I want to do is create something that is easy to read. And I try to replicate what I send as much as possible. I know it's stupid stuff, but visual ethics, aesthetics go a long way, right? I mean, don't we like to see attractive people, right? Don't we look at People magazine and want to see people that are beautiful? Well, surely you want to see spreadsheets that are beautiful too, right? So, you know, you can highlight stuff. I mean, there's a bunch of techniques. One day, I keep promising this. I've got like an hour and a half video on stupid Excel tips. I would send it, but I don't know if you people watch the videos that I send. So, but just stuff like, you know, there's underlines and bolds and you can get rid of grid lines and you can use highlights. There's a bunch of techniques to pop stuff out that you want, right? But, so the first thing up it, you know, I got a title, I got the property, I got the buyer, I got the seller with their address, and I've got the settlement statement with the date, okay? If I would have been really smart, I would have probably put a timestamp on it as well, because that's what happens with these things. There's the 2 o'clock version, there's a 2:30 version because somebody makes a change, there's a 5 o'clock version, there's a 7:30 version, and so on, okay? I said I wanted it combined, so I created, I'm going to shrink this a little bit, I created a buyer and a seller section. Now, I'm actually, let me see if I can just do this, because what I want to do is, I don't want to jump. Okay, so consideration, so the purchase price. The purchase price is a charge to the buyer and a credit to the seller. So the purchase price needs to go both. Okay? Now, let me jump to what I said before, because I want to jump to the punchline real quick, and then we'll go through all of the... When we get to the bottom, one of the things I remember saying specifically was that totals, charges and credits needed to balance. They didn't need to equal between buyer and seller, but for the buyer and for the seller, they need to balance. And they balance with a plug, and the plug is amount due to or from the buyer, amount due or to the seller. Ballpark. Guy's buying a building for $40 million. He's assuming a $20 million mortgage. He put $20 million in deposits. He better be close to zero to close. By the way, in reality, I didn't include everything that was in the case because it really would have complicated things. You know, typically, you're not going to close until as a buyer you've funded more than what you need. So, if this were a real case, I would have had to send another $100,000 in so that I would get some money back at closing. Because nobody can close until you got all the cash in to close. Okay, so in this case, the buyer still has to come up with another $68,000. Okay, this guy sold the building for $20 million. He's relieved of for $40 million. He's relieved of a $20 million mortgage. He better be close to $20 million, and we'll figure out why. There's some other payments. He's got some escrows that he's got to give up. He's got some income that's, you know, that he's collected that he's got to prorate. He's got some expenses that he's got to pay that he hasn't paid yet, and he's got a pretty big commission out there that he's got that he's gotta be responsible for, so, that's how you get the 17 from the 20, bless you. But notice, that number becomes a plug. So, but we gotta account for, there's things that only affect the buyer, there are things that only affect the seller, and there are things that affect both. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. So I grouped all the deposits. So, I mean, you could have put them all in one line, but this makes it a lot easier to just tick on so-and-so date, on so-and-so date, on so-and-so date. Okay, just makes it a lot easier to tick. Could you have grouped them all? Yeah. Would you typically see so many in real life? No, you'd see maybe 2. Okay, you'd probably see 1, and then you'd see another one just before with another $100,000 or whatever to get yourself to close. Okay, now we go to prorations. So when we talk about prorations, and again, there's no hard and fast rule on this, on how to group them. You got to try to do stuff that's logical, right? So there are certain things that need to be allocated between the buyer and the seller. Okay. I'm going to work from the bottom up because it's a little bit easier, right? The landlord, the seller, had collected some deposits from his tenants. He's no longer going to be the landlord. The tenant is going to look for the buyer to collect those when their lease is up. So I got to transfer. I got to charge this guy and I got to credit this guy. Okay? Make sense? And so under John's scenario, this guy can now release his escrow. You know, he's got to release it from escrow, and this guy's got to escrow that with somebody else and not commingle the funds and not hypothecate them and all the other things that he said. We talked about the committed and unfunded tenant improvements, right? So this guy committed to a tenant. I'm paying for cash flow. In order to realize that cash flow, I've got to spend those $523,000. So this guy's getting credit for that cash flow, but I got to pay something that he should have paid. Okay, so again, he's going to be charged for this, and I'm going to be credited for that because I'm going to have to pay for that as a buyer in the future.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so in the study it said that the TI was paid directly to the tenant at closing. So the TI goes to the tenant. Why would you credit?
It says that here.
I'm getting it.
You sure it says that here?
That's how I read it. I read it that way.
Committed to reimburse the existing tenant.
Yeah, to reimburse the existing.
But does it say you paid them? Okay,
No.
so.
Oh, no, he just gave
Yeah.
a commitment to, and
Yeah,
now
and
they're
then just-
assuming the commitments.
No, and just pragmatically, I think we talked about this the other day, and so, you know, sometimes we say a lot of stuff here that maybe flies by, just the way it is. It would not be common for you to pay dollars to a tenant to do his TI. You would typically want to do the TI yourself, because you want to make sure that permits get pulled. You want to make sure that the quality of the work is up to the standard that you have. And you want to make sure that it gets spent appropriately and not shortcutted. Okay, so TI allowances almost always get, that's why it's an allowance, not a check. Okay, not an incentive. Okay, property taxes. Got a problem in my formula here, I think. Got a problem with both of these things. They're 50-50 and they shouldn't be, and I don't know why, but let's go back. So I've got a supporting worksheet, okay, and so, here, I must have saved something along the way, okay, so C28. Why is this? Okay, let's just do property taxes first. Oh, I know what the problem is. No. Oh, no, sorry. No, that's right. Sorry, I got confused for a second.
They're equal, they're not half.
Yeah, no, I
what
got
you're saying.
confused there for a second. Okay, so let's do property taxes. And this is something that we can talk about forever. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but property taxes last year were $501,000. I went ahead and said, you know what, I'm gonna put an inflation factor on it of 3%. Cost of living, under normal conditions, the property's gonna be revalued by 3%. So for the current year, it'll be about 517. What happens typically in a commercial real estate transaction? Properties get revalued. That's the one time that they get revalued big. So that becomes a source of contention in negotiating a purchase-sale agreement, which is how much are you going to, hold back or ascribe or prorate to the buyer and the seller. So if you use last year's number or you use a small cost of living increase, the seller will always be happy. The buyer's always going to try to push it a little bit more. Sometimes you see a holdback, and you say, okay, we're going to estimate 3%, but then we'll hold some money back till the end, till the assessment comes in, and then we'll settle accounts at that point. Okay. One question that came to me was, does the day of sale belong to the buyer, or does it belong to the seller?
The buyer.
Okay, you can negotiate it.
Oh.
I would say in the absence of negotiation, I would say it would typically go to the buyer. Okay? That's my experience. But if you've got the issue, you negotiate. And in theory, if you're splitting hairs on that, you're probably fighting about the wrong thing. Okay? Because you're gonna, potentially also split some revenue as well. Okay? So as it relates to property taxes, $232,000, which is 162 days that the seller occupied the building, is going to be charged to him and credited to the buyer, because the buyer is going to have to pay that at the end of the year. Okay, any questions on that? And then we've got to prorate rents. Now, I didn't give you the rent number for the month. I was shocked, I was disappointed to see that some people were prorating $4.5 million from one side of the equation to the other. So when we talk about rents, when we quote rents in this country, what are we quoting? Rents what? Annual or monthly rents?
Annual.
We're quoting, in commercial leases, we're quoting annual rents. So you multiply the square footage by the in place, right, by the occupancy, the total, the gross rents for the year are $4.5 million. That means that the monthly rent is $381,000. There's a couple of different ways to skin this cat. You could say, you can negotiate, if you close mid-month, you can negotiate and say, I don't want to prorate rents. You collect whatever's outstanding. Whatever happened before is yours. You give me a credit. You give me a credit, okay? And we move on. Or you can also assume receivables, okay? So there's different things that you can work on. What you try to do is make sure that the seller wants to make sure that he's collected everything so he can prorate, feeling comfortable that he's collected it, okay? You can also assume the responsibility for collecting it for him and then settle accounts on that. But I didn't complicate the case here. 12 days to the seller, so he's got 18 days for the buyer, so he's got to give the buyer $229,000 because rents are paid in advance, meaning the seller would have collected it, the buyer's not going to collect it, so again, the seller's going to be charged, the buyer's going to be credited. Any questions on that? No questions. Surprise. Pretty simple, right? Commissions, this was very simple. I mean, 70 basis points and 4%. Just as a point of information, I mentioned that this in real life. There was a seller settlement statement and a buyer settlement statement. And as a buyer, the escrow agent did not want to give us the seller settlement statement. And the seller didn't want to give it to us, didn't want to give it to us, he didn't want to give it to us. And somehow I talked my way into getting it. And the reason they didn't want to show it to us is because, so this was what was then a publicly traded company that was called NNN, Triple Net. And this, we bought this from, they sponsored a bunch of what were tenant in common investments. So there were actually like 28 tenant in commons here. So they basically just sold an investment package to people. And they had a 4% disposition fee, which is totally out of market. It is not unusual for a sponsor, a general partner in a deal to get some sort of disposition fee. It might be 1 point, it might be 2 points, it's never 4 points. And so they were very guarded about that, and so that's why they didn't want to show that to us, you know, because, you know, I don't know what other deals they had as far as promoted interests and all that, but I'm sure that it was probably very rich. Okay, so that one's pretty simple. I mean, so do you see why this doesn't take that? I mean, this is pretty simple, right? If you just gather the facts and work through it. I mean, wow. I mean, okay. Let's get to a loan. A loan had a bunch of stuff going on.
Do that.
I really only want to focus on one of it. So there were doc stamps that had to be paid on the refiling. Okay, there was a certain number of, you know, cents or whatever, dollars per thousand. There was insurance, property tax, and capital reserve escrows that had been held or were being held by the master servicer. Okay, so this guy's now got to be credited for it because those are monies he had in deposit that he needs to get back, and this guy's got to be charged because those are deposits he's got to essentially account for. Okay, so notice that that's opposite of the tenant security deposits. Okay, now he gets credited for a deposit that he made, which basically go to offset legal fees. There was an assumption fee. You couldn't come up with the assumption fee until you came up with the loan payment. Okay, and then there was accrued interest that needed to be accounted for. Mortgages are paid how in this country typically?
Interest is charged.
Actually.
Are mortgages paid in advance or in arrears?
Advance.
Advance.
Okay, rents in this country are paid in advance.
Yeah.
Oh, that's.
Mortgages are paid in
Arrears.
arrears.
Oh, yes.
So if rents are paid in advance, typically a seller would have collected money that he's got to provide for the buyer, right? If interest is paid in arrears and a loan is being assumed, the seller has to give a credit to the buyer, right? I'm sorry, the seller needs to give a credit to the buyer. Did I say that?
Yes.
The seller needs to give a credit to the buyer for the interest that they incurred that they're not going to pay for at the end of the month, okay? Now I'm going to go to those. Again, I said I was surprised that several of the people attempted this didn't amortize the loan. And I've always had, I struggle with the fact that in this program for a lot of years now, I'm even having folks struggling with amortizing the loan. I'm going to show you a couple of things on that. The first thing I'm going to do, I did this for a friend of mine's kid and his wife in Spain last summer. They were wanting to buy a house. I just built like a little, that's why it's in euros. I mean, I just did a little amortization table for them, right? And I put payment, I solved for PMT in Excel here. And basically, you can change it, any of the numbers in green, you know, what's the purchase price, what's the loan to value, what's the interest reserve, and what's the term, and then I calculate the payment, and then it populates an amortization table, okay? So, I mean, you guys have done this in Dr. Forgey's class, haven't you?
Yes.
Right? It's not that difficult, is it?
No.
Now, did anybody who do the case realize that the mortgage facts I gave you did not amortize properly?
What do you mean?
You did.
Yeah,
You did.
Tell
You
me
could have, well, yeah, you're like, but it was funky, right?
It was off by a bit, so.
Yeah, and that's really the way it was. I gave you real facts, and at the end of the day, I never got an answer. But I got an estoppel letter from the bank that said, the payoff is this. And I could come close to it. I knew what the payment was going to be going forward. Okay? And as long as I know what the payoff is, it really doesn't matter to me how we got there. Because I'm going to be credited for it and you're going to be charged for it, okay? And so what did I do to come up with, so in this particular case, I just set up an amortization table. Right? I came up here, right? I did a couple of other things just to show you, but okay, so I just took the facts as they were given to me. Interest rate, balance. So I came up with the interest, right, and the principal. There was some negative amortization because there was a 45-day period, not a 30-day period from closing to when the first payment was due. Okay, and I just worked it all down to. I worked it on down to a balance on June 1st of $20 million. So the 1% is 202,700 and whatever dollars. Okay. And this is the interest for the month, which needs to be prorated at so much per day, and you've got 13 days or 12 days, whatever, right? That's got to be charged to the seller. Okay. Now, what I did also was I went ahead and tried to calculate using the cumulative principal. Now, I'm not going to get an exact number because there's a problem, and I want to show you there's a problem with the numbers I gave you. It doesn't fully, amortize that way, right? But you could do an amortization table, or you could use cumulative principal or cumulative interest to calculate what a balance is at a particular point in time. And I'm assuming that you would have done those things in Dr. Forgey's class. So here are the problems. If you look at the facts. If you look at the facts that I gave you and you solve for payment, the payment should be $119,000.
The rate's off.
Not 120.
Is the rate correct? I don't know if that's going to make a
No,
difference.
well, I don't know so there's something not right. The facts I gave you were the facts that were given to us by the lender, by the master servicer. So there was a difference between what I amortized and what the estoppel letter said. But notice what I said. It doesn't matter what I calculated. It's a little bit off. It doesn't matter to me as long as what I'm assuming, what I'm being, I'm credited with is what the other guy's being charged, okay? And as long as I understand the terms going forward, right? So if you solve for payment, right, these are just the Excel functions, right? So if you solve for payment, given the factors that are given to you, right? I gave you interest rate, balance, term. Said if you solve for payment, the payment should be 119, not 120. But they told us the payment was 120. If you solve for rate, the rate would actually come out to 6.7, not 5.2. And if you solve for present value, the present value would be 21,750, not 21,500. So where it went wrong, I don't know. Okay, but there was definitely a problem there. But I could have gotten into it further. I don't know what the issue was, okay? And then, just to finalize this, there were a series of, miscellaneous charges back and forth. This guy had to pay his attorney. This guy had to pay his attorney. There were endorsements, untitled policy, doc stamps, copies, surveys, that kind of stuff, and everybody was responsible for one item or another. But ultimately, it's where you come up to. This guy gets 17 million bucks, and this guy starts to come up with $68,000 to close the deal. Yeah. I'm going to spend 25 minutes going over. I sent a video out. I did not check how many people looked at it or not. If you don't look at it, it's okay. I want to go through some of the material. But it's knowledge, and it's important knowledge. At the end of the day, the case study that I assigned for the last two case studies, for me, are the most valuable case studies that you can take from this course or from this program. If you don't do them, that's okay. What's the most valuable thing? Because at the end of the day, if you're in a development program, what you're solving for, ultimately, is the sources and uses of cash. I want to develop something, and the question is going to be, how much is it going to cost me, and how am I going to fund it? I can do a balance sheet all day long. I'm going to develop those assets, and here's my capital stack. I'm going to borrow so much, and I'm going to put in so much. But if I can't figure out on a period basis how much I'm going to spend every month and how I'm going to fund that, I could fall down right here. Because if I don't have the right debt lined up, or it doesn't come in until certain conditions happen, I'm going to fall down. So as a developer, if you don't do, oh, we're going to come up with a budget. Okay, great. But if you don't lay it out on how it's going to happen, what is it? If you don't plan, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, right? So at the end of the day, if we don't take a budget and then distribute it, what are we done? The reality is also, I mean, you're working as a PM, Alec, aren't you, in construction? Slightly different, it's a little subset, but you have a budget, you have a timeline associated with that. And then eventually that budget is going to become your benchmark on a month-to-month basis as you're doing your cost accounting. Okay? And it also becomes the basis for you to, if you're a GC, to bill your customers, if you're a developer, to send your loan draws, if you're a developer, to send your funding requests to your partners. Because at the end of the day, you're building, you're incurring a bunch of costs, okay? And now you need capital for it. So every month, you got to go to a lender. And every month, you got to go to a partner. And you've got to provide information that they're going to go back then and look at the budget you gave them, and because they got a plan. How's the bank going to loan? You think you just send a funding draw to a bank and they're going to pay you? Not if it doesn't correlate with a budget. You think a partner, if all of a sudden you told a partner that you needed $600,000 this month and you send him a bill for $4 million, you think he's going to give it to you? I mean, it doesn't work like that. So we gotta practice this stuff. You know, I mean, this, and again, this isn't like high math or anything like that. I mean, this stuff ultimately really is nothing but you know, addition and subtraction, and using basic Excel. That's all. Nothing more than that. I sent out something I'm going to go over. And then I'll do a little bit of a presentation. This is probably a 20-minute version of what's in the video. It's, you know, and I did it pretty detailed in the video. Okay, so if you think it's interesting and you haven't seen it, go back and take a look at it. I think you'll find it interesting. I say it all the time. Development is a capital-intensive business, and so it's really lends itself to. You know, it's really focused on the capital stack in a business, okay? And it's really focused on how I get funds to build it. So how do I secure debt? We talked about real estate sort of as a rule of thumb, being 70% levered. How do I develop a capital stack that's 70% debt and 30% equity? And how do I get that? How do I fund it? Okay, and so we tend to do a lot of partnerships, so we secure debt, and we tend to find equity partners for deals as developers, okay? The genesis of all of this stuff, or the source of all this, is ultimately becomes what we call a sources and uses statement. So we'll take a development budget, we will accumulate all of the costs, right, that are going to go into that development, and what we're really going to do is put it out over the timeline of the development, you know, project, and we're going to detail the uses that we have, and we're going to detail the sources of capital that we have, okay? So whether it's equity, which is typically how it flows, and then debt, right? We're going to go on a month-to-month basis and populate how we're spending and how we're funding, okay? This is not totally directly tied to this, but I think it's important. typically, in the absence of anything else, the way capital flows into a development project is equity flows first. If there is a mezz component or a subordinated debt component, that will flow second. And finally, your secured debt will come in last. As you're distributing out of a partnership, the preference is typically reversed. So typically you would repay debt first. You would repay any mezz or subordinated debt second, and you would repay capital last. Okay, and that's typically lender mandated. I mean, I'm going to jump a little bit. When you have a construction loan and you're doing for sale product, there is typically a release price associated with every unit that's being sold. So the lender will not release the mortgage on, or a partial release on the mortgage, until they get the dollars that were agreed to for that unit released. Case in point, let's just do a land development. We buy 100 acres. It's broken up into 4 parcels. We're going to develop these 3, we're going to sell this one. The lender says, okay, I'm going to loan you 100 for this, okay? Just make it round numbers, hypothetical. And I'm going to give you a release price of 25 for every quarter of this. Tomorrow I go find another developer who's going to do a different use here, a limited use hotel or whatever. I sell it for 30. The lender will release that part of the parcel from the mortgage subject to a repayment of 25. Okay? And if you typically don't have that agreed to at the beginning of, your debt agreement, it may be very difficult to negotiate after the fact. Okay? So I'm kind of jumping.
Is it because they kind of have you over a barrel in a way?
Well, yeah, and there's costs associated with that, and again, going back to matching, they loaned you 100, they loaned you 100, but it really comes back to, you're going to want to give them the least that you want, and they're going to want the most, and if you haven't agreed on that, you're going to get into a stalemate, okay, and they do have you over a barrel, because you can't sell it if they don't release. So the sources and uses statement really becomes the basis of our development process. There's a lot of packages out there. You guys do an Argus, you do a course in Argus. Argus has a bunch of different products and modules. People use that, but ultimately most of that, especially when you get into a large development project, will dump that information into an Excel spreadsheet. Okay, so people use the packages because Excel gives you, so there's a lot of functionality in Argus, and you can overlay debt components, leverage. It's a lot easier to work on that in Excel. Okay, and ultimately what happens is while most development projects are not under the sort of public realm, you're gonna have to share that information. So you're gonna have to give it to a banker, so their credit people can play with it. You're going to have to give it to an institutional partner so that their analysts can play with it. You're going to have to give it to somebody else in the office to play with it. And so Excel just becomes a lot easier to play with than flying and sending Argus models around, because not everybody's got that same competency with Argus. So Excel spreadsheets tend to work. I'm going to repeat a couple of things here that I know we've talked about on the periphery. Most projects have a significant component of debt. Now I'm going to kind of give you a sort of progression, and I've said this before. Historically, developers would go out and get what were called ADC loans: acquisition, development, and construction loans. And along those lines, the lender will give you money to buy land, pay for all of your soft costs, your development costs, and then build your construction. I would say over the last several years, while you may see some of that, what you've really seen is the lending world getting away from ADC loans and really just focusing on construction loans. Okay, you may at times get a land loan. Collateral is tough. Most lenders probably will not give you more than 50% on a land loan. And typically, the land loan is only, it's relationship driven, okay? A lender will say, okay, I know you, I do a lot of business with you on, but land's tough for a bank. There's no cash flow from land. So it's tough for banks to get their hands around. So you don't really see land being financed that much anymore. So you're typically going to see the developer's going to have to provide equity for that somehow. Maybe that's where the equity piece, the partnership piece comes in, okay? So, so you don't really see acquisition and development and construction loans which pay for everything. You really see construction loans. And so typically you're seeing, it's kind of interesting, if you look at a development, construction is the single largest line item in most development projects. Curiously, in a lot of projects, it's about 70%. And that kind of becomes the loan to value of most loans. And so, in most deals, you got to put about 30% equity into the deals. And that equity comes in first, so you're going to have to buy the land, pay a lot of the soft costs that don't really have a lot of value to a lender. And once you've got all that in, then a lender will come in and say, okay, I'll give you the money to go vertical. Okay? Construction, so loans come in a variety of different ways. So typically when you do a construction loan, that construction loan is for a fixed period of time. And typically it covers a construction period. Those are typically interest-only loans. But in addition to being interest-only loans, there's a specific nuance associated with them, which is that they don't really have a payment component, rather they have an interest reserve component. So typically what you would see is, let's say that I need $10 million to build something, right? I would not get a $10 million loan, I would get, let's say, a $10.7 million loan. Why would I get that? Well, the bank would build into the loan a $700,000 interest reserve. So every month, as I borrow $1 million, I also borrow the $70,000 of interest that I need to pay. And so it actually sort of flows through, because the bank needs to be repaid in order to have the loan current. Okay, so most construction loans, there's no cash flow, there's really no source of repayment. They will be interest only, but that interest is funded typically through an interest reserve on the loan, okay? Okay, so the lender will loan you the money to build, and will loan you the money to pay him the interest during the construction period.
Question.
Yes.
That's earned, so every month when you do a draw, that
You tap into the interest reserve. Whatever was owed for interest for the month before, you borrow from the reserve.
so okay, so the interest is not like compounding.
No.
No,
Upon
you're paying the interest currently.
Okay.
And more like, I would say more like a revolving line, or like not revolving because you don't really pay it back. It's like a line of credit. You're just borrowing. It's almost as if they give you two loans: a loan to borrow to build, and a loan to pay interest off.
Yeah.
Okay. Now,
But you pay the principal constantly.
you don't pay principal.
Nothing.
You have no cash flow.
Interest.
You pay interest only. You got no cash flow.
I got you.
So you pay interest only, but you don't pay because you got no cash flow.
Yeah.
So they loan you the interest as well.
Wow.
Okay? Now, you typically see these loans for a period of time up until construction's finished. And at that point, you need to replace it with permanent financing. Now, pragmatically, what you typically see is construction loans will extend up until stabilization, because a permanent lender is not going to loan you money until you got stabilized cash flow. So if the construction period, let's say, is estimated to be 18 months, you might get a 24 or a 30-month loan, okay? And maybe what happens is, once a CO is issued, now you got to start paying the interest currently. Now you can't go to the interest reserve, or there's enough interest reserve built in that'll cover you for a couple of months after that, okay? But typically the gun is on you now as a developer to get stabilized and replace that debt. And what a lot of lenders will do, they will do construction to mini-perm. So they'll say, you know what, we don't want to go through this dysfunction, and we don't want to put the developer through that, and once we, it's an asset we know, So they'll do maybe a 60-month loan, 18 months for construction, and at that point, it converts in feature. There's no more interest reserve. Now you start amortizing the loan for the next 36 months. Okay? And you know, you might amortize it over 15 years or 30 years, and then there's a balloon, and then at that point, you get permanent financing in. Curiously, I recently saw something that I'd never seen, and that is construction to permanent. And I was on the finance committee at the yacht club, and last year with the old City National, what's it called now? BCI, whatever, the Chilean bank. I guess it's still called City National, but they've given us a construction loan into a 15-year term. So there's an 18-month construction period. At the end of the 18 months, so construction loans tend to be variable interest, LIBOR plus. So at the end of that 18 months, the interest gets fixed, and you got a 15-year mortgage fully amortizing at some sort of index plus at that point. So these guys have actually gone out and said, hey, we'll give you the whole life. Okay? From beginning of construction all the way to end. Now, in the yacht club, as with any other thing, so it's like a $13, $14 million project, the first $3 million have come out of our reserves. Once we've funded all the architecture, the engineering, the permitting, the impact fees, blah, 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 and even some of the site work, once we've funded all that, then the bank comes in and funds the balance of the construction. Okay?
But is this particular thing, is it the interest on the fixed loan is agreed upon at the beginning?
It's typically tied to an index, so it'll be, you know, the 10-year Treasury plus, or 30-year LIBOR plus, or 50. Okay.
And your credit too is factored into that, maybe, or your.
Well, you estimate it, you figure out, but you know it's floating till then, but you have no other way of fixing it. Okay, so construction loans tend to be short-term in nature, variable interest rate, interest only, have interest reserves. Permanent financing, we've talked about, tends to be, you know, longer-term in nature. And we talked about some of the features the other day. They could be fully amortizing, they could be partially amortizing, they could be interest only for a while, they could be interest only for a long time. They may have prepayment provisions, they may be locked out the prepayment, they may have yield maintenance, they may have defeasance, okay, or not. Okay?
Are you charged for extending until stabilization? So.
It depends what you negotiate.
Okay, so that's another.
So my suggestion to you would be if you're doing a construction loan, you should from day one always contemplate negotiating something that carries you to stabilization, so that you've got the time to properly structure permanent financing. And frankly, doing a construction to mini perm, so if you're thinking, and again, I use 18, 24 months as a good period, most commercial projects, I'd be thinking about 36 to 48 month construction to mini perm, because those are typically going to be able to be repaid without any kind of penalty or prepayment penalty. All you want is, you as a developer want the flexibility to be able to stabilize and get your best permanent deal, or sell the property if you want to sell it. And as the bank, you want to make sure that the developer has got sufficient cash flow to service a loan. Because what you don't want is to have a non-performing loan on your books. Okay? So we talk about that. I mentioned, I want to talk a little about, we don't spend a lot of time talking about construction here, but single largest component of a development budget is typically construction in most projects. Construction is typically done by a general contractor, and a general contractor is he's a paper tiger is what he is. I mean, he sells and then he buys. He's sort of a middleman. But a GC can function in a lot of different ways, but I'll typically break it down into two. They can self-perform. You contract them, and he has the employees and the equipment to do the work, or he'll be more of a construction manager, or he will contract a bunch of subspecialties to do the work, okay? That GC will typically work under a couple of different contractual type arrangements. They will work on a cost-plus basis, or they will work under what's called a GMP, a guaranteed maximum price basis. How do you work that way? Well, it depends on the market, depends on the project, depends on who's got the bargaining power at that point, okay? Because ultimately it's risk. If you're doing cost-plus, the risk is typically on the client. If you're doing GMP, a guaranteed maximum price, the risk is typically with the contractor. Now, there's ways to mitigate that risk, and there's ways to create incentives on both sides to mitigate those risks, okay? So, and there's also, so the market may dictate, right? There's a lot of demand for work. Construction companies don't want to take risks. They're saying, look, we're only going to do work on a cost-plus basis, because you know what? I'm not going to assume any risk. Things are slow. You know, the developers really are driving the game. Construction companies have no choice but to lock in prices. So the market's going to dictate that. But there's also going to be situations. I remember we did a large project at the Lowe's Hotel on the beach. We knew the Tisch family. They were partners of ours. We had built that building many years earlier, and they wanted to do a huge refurbishment, but they weren't sure what they wanted to do. But, you know, the owners knew the owners. We were partners in deals, and we just said, look, they'll do a cost plus. And so, you know, every time that a phase was sort of, okay, let's do the lobby now. Go out there, get the architect, you know, and then we'd go out and price all the work, because we were construction managers. We'd go price all the work. We'd give it to them. And then, you know, we would just add our fee to it, okay? Now, there's ways to create incentives, right? So you may have a budget and a cost plus, and you could create an incentive where you'll share with the GC any savings over that budget. You can also drive the GC the other way. Even though he's got a GMP, you can do a cost sharing with him as well, where you open book, you do an open book arrangement, and when the job's done, you come in and see how much profit he's made, and you split that profit. So there's different ways to incentivize and to mitigate the risk when you're working in those scenarios, okay? And then there's different other, they're doing a project up at Fordham, and what they've structured with Tishman is I forget what they call it, but it basically, at the end of the day, it's a cost plus, but it's like they call it a managed GMP. But what it really is they're getting a fee to go out there and bid the job for you. Okay, so but at the end of the day, it's the risk is with the client, right? Because you're going to pay for the cost plus a fee, or the risk is with the construction company or the contractor, where he or she has to assume a maximum, they guarantee a maximum price. How do they backstop that risk? They typically will then go to subs and get GMPs from the subs. Okay? I'm not going to get into how the billings work, because you can see that in the video, but it's really important to know these things, okay? Because at the end of the day, construction companies don't fund projects for their clients. They do work, bill, collect, all in the same month, and keep doing the work. And the subs do the same thing with the construction company. That's why it's a paper monster, right? So the GC hires the sub, I'm doing the work, I send you an invoice, you gather all the invoices, you send it to the developer gathers all the invoices, he sends it to the bank funds him, he funds the general contractor funds me, and I keep going. And if you don't pay this guy, well, he's got mechanic lien rights, right? And the law will protect him as long as he follows the law. So if you're providing material to a construction site, you send a notice to the owner to make sure that the owner knows that you've got rights, okay? And if you don't get paid, you stop working. And the first problem that, GCs run into is they keep working when they don't get paid. And then now you're at risk. Now you gotta make sure that the project keeps going. So no ticket, no laundry. You don't get paid, you stop working. Okay, and so and you don't have that problem in like real projects, okay? But you do in smaller projects. So if you're dealing with an institutional partner, with a national construction company, you're never gonna run in that situation because you'll never enter into a contract unless there's a construction loan in place with a reputable lender. And you've got a client that's a reputable developer. And so you know that when you submit, and it's all timed, you set the dates, right? Invoices in on the 3rd to the GC, on the 5th they go to the construction, to the developer, on the 8th they're at the bank funds on the 12th, the GC's funded on the 17th, he funds, and as you're paying, you're getting a partial release from the GC or from the subs on the work that's been done. Because you don't want to pay and retain those mechanic lien rights, okay? So as you're paying, you're releasing partially that lien that exists. Yes,
I
Oz?
have 2 questions. One, how does that, when the developer actually submits over the request for payment to the bank, that he's taking the whole budget and then saying, okay, this amount of stuff, including like administration costs?
No, I'll show you. I'll show you, and it's in the video, and I'll show you when we take a little break. Right, I'll come back and just spend a couple of minutes on it. Again, most loans today are going to be construction loans, so they are going to fund hard costs coming from, supported by, and I sent you guys the AIA forms, the G702 and G703. You're going to have to get that form signed by the architect. Okay, typically some owner's rep will have come in and certified the work as well, and you'll as a developer will certify it as well to the bank. Okay, and the bank's typically only going to pay what's on that G703.
So I'm basically,
You're paying
developers paying all the soft costs themselves.
Well,
their equity.
right, and so typically, because the developer doesn't have that, the developer will have a joint venture partner. So every month, that development manager, that PM, is sending 2 funding draws out, one to the bank and one to his equity partners. And to this one, he's sending my construction costs, and to this one, he's sending my architectural fees, my development fee, and all of my G&A. Yes, Aaron?
We're seeing a lot of like the JVs, because there's so many people involved in those, they're starting to put the soft costs into escrow accounts and just
Actually funding up front and just, okay, I mean, if there's liquidity, people will do that. And the problem becomes, Aaron, really, at the end of the day, is it's an IRR issue, right?
Yeah.
If I am an institutional partner, and I'm gonna, commit to a deal, and I'm gonna put $5 million day one, I'm gonna expect a clock on my IRR to start that day.
Yeah.
Because I've already given, even if it's an escrow, that money's out my door, right? And the developer's going to say, no, the clock starts ticking when I pull it out of escrow. And so really you have to go back then to the funding source for the institutional partner. Because, look, I was involved in a venture with Prudential, and Prudential in this particular case was managing a separate account. So you could have commingled accounts in the institutional fund world, or you could have separate accounts. Commingled means I raised the PRESA Fund 1, Prudential Real Estate Investors Fund number 1, and we all put in $10 million into it. A separate account is I've got a relationship with the Virginia retirement system, the Pennsylvania retirement system, the Texas teachers, CalPERS, CalSteers, whatever, the Ontario teachers, and you give me $500 million in a discretionary fund. You draw the box. We're going to do value add, hospitality in the Southeast, or we're going to do industrial in Port City, whatever the box is. And so in that case, in a separate account case, it's very easy to say, listen, I'm going to send my merchant developer is going to send me a funding draw every month, and I'm going to get it from him every month or from her, and then I also don't get charged on money until she gives it to me, because I'm also under the IRR clock. So, yeah, it's a lot easier to put the money in escrow, but there's a cost with money. So it's like a hot potato. Like you don't want it till you need it. Okay? So, but that's interesting. That's interesting to. GCs make money in 3 different ways. The easiest one is they earn a fee. So, you know, depending on the size of the project, I want to say broadly 3 to 5%. Small scale projects maybe 10%, but in large projects you want to do 3 to 5. The developers, is that what you're seeing? I mean, the developers will work for 5 to 6. You get into a fight. Does the land count? Does it not count? Do you earn fees on contingencies? I mean, there's all kinds of fights that you get into. But so GCs work. Now GCs can also work. They can also assume the developer role, and they can do something that they call design build. And so they'll actually go from soup to nuts, and so they'll basically double up their fees. They'll assume the fees of a GC and a developer. So they'll probably work for 10 to 12 points, and they'll hire the architect, they'll hire the planners, they'll hire the engineers. They'll either self-perform or maybe bid the work out to a third party, and they'll give you the keys the day it's done. They'll secure the financing, they'll act as a developer. So you see there's some large design build firms around that focus on doing that kind of stuff. So, is there anything else the GCs make money on fees. They can make money when they buy the projects out. So they'll go out and estimate it, right? So you send me a request, I go out and price it, I give you a guaranteed maximum price, but I haven't bought the job yet because it hasn't been awarded to me yet. So when the job is actually awarded to me and I go out and buy it, I'm going to then squeeze my suppliers at that point. So I may make some money on that, okay? And in the third place...
When you say you mean you're the GC?
As a GC, me as a GC. So if I'm the GC, you're the client, I'm the GC. You send me an RFP, I go to all my subs, I get a price, I give you my GMP, right? You award the job to me. Now I go to these guys, but then I go to other guys and say, look, Aaron, I really want to give you the job, but you're just not close enough. Well, that happens all the time, doesn't it? It happens all the time. So now I got a fixed price with my client.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to start squeezing my subs to make money on that.
Like the margin.
Yeah, so now I've got a fee you're paying me, and now I'm making a margin on my buyout of the job. And then the third place where you can make money, there's actually a fourth place too, but the third place where you make money is on what's called general conditions. And the general conditions is the overhead on a project. What's overhead? Okay, the construction office, the internet service, the project manager that's on site, the garbage hauling. So, it could be nickel and dime money, but they pay out like, I don't know, probably pay them $200,000 a year, $250 at least. At least. But when, which is, what, $50 an hour or whatever, but when you bill it to the client, you say, no, the PM's actually $70 an hour. So you make, or you say, plus I got to pay him 38% of his salary as benefits, but it's really only 27%. So you make money on that. And then probably the last place where the GC makes money is they're in a job, and I got to change something. You got change orders. Then you charge whatever the hell you want to charge at that point because my experience is typically it's not, okay? Typically the client doesn't have a lot of choice. And so I'm not saying you can rape your client when you're the GC at that point, but they're kind of stuck with you, okay? And you're going to charge them whatever you want to charge them. Well, and that's the client is the one that's driving the changes, all right? Or they may come because of changes things that aren't feasible when you get to the site. You've got conditions that just don't work, right? Or engineering issues that all of a sudden don't, it doesn't work the way it was drawn. So now you've got the changes, but again, if you have an open book arrangement, you can always come back and say, hey, you know, I want some of whatever that profit was that you made, okay?
Can it work the other way, like if the contractor doesn't give you what you're asking for because he's chosen subpar subs, and
Well, you know, now you get into, you know, warranty issues, right? Again, that's why it's important to, you know, pick the right contractor, right? And have the right specs on the material that you know, if you want concrete that's gonna do a certain, and that's totally outside my realm, but you want concrete that's gonna support something, you better spec that, you know? And rebar that, you know, so, there's a couple of, one other thing I wanted to, this is like a whole other, you guys do construction management in this too, don't you? So you probably should know all these things already, right? I would hope you know a little bit more. So typically, so what I did say is that the GC gets paid every month, but to protect the client doesn't pay all of what is billed every month. So the client's typically allowed to hold back something, which is what we call retainage. So they're allowed to retain a certain amount. Now, rule of thumb, you retain 10%, okay? But there's some exclusions. Stored material, so material that's paid for directly and stored on site typically has no retainage, because the presumption is you've got to pay a supplier for that, okay? So, you know, direct material that comes in and it's stored on site that you know it's essentially yours, you don't retain any funds. And then you get all kinds of arrangements that you can negotiate. Maybe we'll only do retainage for the first, you know, half of the project. After that, maybe we'll only retain 5%. I know for us, and this was a stupid trick we did, but, and I didn't invent it, I inherited it, but we would have this 10% retainage up until halfway in the project, but we would retain from our subs all the way to the end. So for us, that was kind of a cash flow benefit as a construction company. There's all kinds of games that people play with that kind of stuff. So that's all I sent. I sent that handout. So what I just read, what I went over, you know, at least the concept, the shell is there. Why don't we take a 5-minute break at 10 of? We'll come back, I'll finish this, and then we'll jump into some other stuff.
James, it's James. I don't want to dance. You have water?
Yesterday. It was like in like the early evening. So yeah, well, my parents came. No, because it's Father's Day tomorrow. So my parents are in town. I didn't realize it was this week until like my mom was like, "You're coming back next week." I was like, "Wait, what?" She's like, "It's Father's Day." I was like, "What?" Yeah, like rushing to get gifts to my dad. Yeah.
Let's take one thing at a time.
Make it quick to find out. But I had to order something online and it has a guide to it, so I shipped it back to the place.
Or educational.
Are you going to the position?
Only but so much. She only did this
What's my,
No, was.
what's my,
Yes.
Looking into the GC stuff?
Okay.
What did you say? Research on what it takes to actually become a general.
Yeah, it's like you need,
I got all
you need at
that.
least like a year.
I'm bringing out your whole package. I got both.
For like
Do they get credit for educational,
Huh? They do classes,
okay,
talk to me.
alright, sounds good.
What's wrong with you?
I think I must have slept wrong or something.
Did you actually sleep?
I held the earplugs in and then I
You didn't get the phone ones?
I got the phone ones.
You didn't do it right. Did you roll up your hand?
Mhm.
Oh, you did? Damn, that sucks.
No, I didn't hear anything. It was just so annoying.
That film in your ear.
Man, I do what I shoot. I love the feeling, actually.
Well, you need them when you shoot, because you'll be deaf.
It's so much better than the bumps.
And, You use glasses too?
Yeah, eyes and ears,
Yeah.
the main two.
I just don't
Unless you have
like
glasses.
anything.
No, I still doesn't, I don't think it actually protects you.
Well, they say you can wear double goggles and
Yeah,
glasses.
yeah, I think you should cover the sides because you get spin off stuff.
One brain like that is gonna help.
Bueno, pero si ella te está ayudando, o sea, yo no entiendo cuál es el problema.
You know what you mean? Oh,
Earlier.
I don't know how you would do that. You do a warm compress, I'm like, you mean
I
like
was
after
Bueno,
literally
bueno,
just
pues, mismo,
squeezing
olvídate
the
de
muscle
eso, es que
right
no,
now,
you know.
just so I could treat it.
So my whole
Yeah, you know, that, at this point, that's, those are all
All
irrelevant things, you
years.
know.
I literally kept on trying to massage it for the first time.
Bueno, y cuando acabe eso, que va a hacer? Se va a ir a sentar en la silla y en el
Go
sofá.
back and complete that, and then I'm looking at GC, try to
Ok,
jam that out in here.
recuerda que hace,
You need to look at.
recuerda que hace un par de días él pasó prácticamente el día entero, más o menos igual.
Michi Okaku, City College.
Michi?
Yeah, Michi
Así que,
He's an Asian guy.
just gotta, just bang through it, okay? Okay, bueno. Bueno, yo pasaré por ahí cuando acabe.
Wait,
Cuando
can I
break,
see
break.
Yeah, but it's like.
Tie the eye, right?
Brian, you had a question.
Yeah, would you recommend, since the rates are currently low, would you recommend taking advantage of it by taking out a personal line of
I'm going
credit?
there next weekend.
What are you gonna do with the money?
Right after.
I mean, just keep that line of credit open until,
Well, without, a personal line of credit is likely going to be some sort of variable rate instrument, would be my
they don't do
sense.
fixed.
I'm trying to get the spasm.
Unless you pull the money out, it's probably not gonna be fixed.
I just want to like needles or something like.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, because the generally charge interest on the one that you utilize versus having that whole line under that.
Yeah, you're not gonna get a variable line, I'll tell you, you're not gonna get a line that's open-ended with a fixed rate, most likely.
Down the highway.
I'm not telling you, you're not gonna find some crazy guy that may be doing that right now, because those are the kind of things you find in,
Picture
sort of late market late cycle situations where people are doing crazy. But I would doubt that you would get, that.
Definitely not gonna be able to have pride now.
Oh, I forgot you were trying to go.
I'm gonna try to go for a drink and that's it because my fucking neck is killing me.
Look him up. He has a whole thing about jobs that's, he has a list, he's a physicist, he's really smart. He's a whole list about jobs that are becoming automated and jobs that are not.
You just have a presentation.
Think about anything like,
Oh, you can
okay,
make
so
it.
what does an algorithm do?
That's true.
It's repetitive, so anything that's repetitive, anything that requires a lot of
Yeah.
thought processes
Oh, okay.
is not going to be automated because it's too many pathways
Yes.
for
Yeah.
programming to work, correct?
It's yours?
That's mine.
Change my shirt, it's in the car.
That's hiding in pockets. Thank you.
So look up that, it's just like a 10-minute video.
So what industries are you in?
That's why I'm going to law school, because it's not, it's one of the top ones that's not, because it's too much interpretation of that.
Taking GC and real estate? I think
And if anything, real estate, please, it's already being done.
Yeah. Imagine instructions from the next, all those 3D printing.
Anything that, I think, anything that's remote,
Yeah, we got all that.
constantly rote that you're doing over and over again.
We're doing,
Absolutely hate my
Thank you.
habitat.
Did you go to sleep like at a bad angle?
I-
Your position?
I did.
So they installed one of those homeless deterrents.
Okay.
I've never heard this stuff before.
So like,
Until
They
you
have
said
them all
it.
over in Savannah.
Wait, homeless deterrents?
So you know how they have
Yeah,
like
he's got
in
that.
like church parking lots or grocery parking lots,
Oh, good.
they'll have this weird buzzing noise.
So, but we got like,
Mhm.
Those buzzing noises are installed to
Yeah.
prevent homeless people from sleeping in those areas and from just staying there in general.
We found a lot of.
So they installed one of those right outside my
It's,
house. And because they installed it right outside my house,
Expand
I
into
couldn't sleep.
a vacant.
Can you just take it out?
It's not me, it's the church.
I just, I mean, that day that she assigned.
What does it sound like?
How close to church?
Right at that moment. Just, yeah, found this property and.
Every time someone comes
No.
by,
Article.
and then you gotta.
24/7.
it's never,
Doesn't
Wait, how
fucking
close is,
stop.
how is close to church?
It's right on, it's on the opposite side of the fence.
You know, that's a disturbance.
that's what I'm saying, that's,
There was a
That's
because they've had an issue with, like, so.
No, I understand that, but it's not supposed to be that loud. There's a noise control.
I don't have windows that insulate. If I had insulated windows, I wouldn't have heard them. But since I don't, I hear everything outside.
I've never, I don't have, I can't think of a,
You won't notice it until you notice.
Yeah, you should like.
I'm even trying to think of sounds I've heard of
You know, like
back
dog
at
whistle
home,
noise?
but yeah.
Like, imagine that going off 24/7.
But I'm trying to like think of a time like I actually heard it or in a building in a public, because I don't think I have, not even like back in the city, DC.
Where, so let's say that there's an area that they're trying to just go back and like.
That's, oh, it has to, DC.
You can't, the jackhammer, you can't hide the jackhammer. Like, it rattles the building.
I can't even turn my back. Hi.
Oh.
That's what I've been trying to solve all day.
Like,
Like squeezing my neck.
They have an Asian massage place.
Nathan, oh, your favorite cow.
You slept with Benadryl? You would wake up.
Benadryl because I was so tired from
Yeah.
I put in the ear cut.
No, I'm serious, I would definitely complain.
Where do you live?
You know where the Home Depot is, where they have the assembly of lots that we've spoken about? I'm right across the street from that.
Oh.
On Sunrise.
Okay, let's get going.
Or is it
By construction?
Yeah. Or Wilson
Glass.
downtown.
Oh, good.
Glass.
I'm right by Flagler.
Good. You can do our supply.
Glass. Okay, so, just the conclusion of this, and again, this is all in that video I sent, so I just want to do this quickly. I work, these are real life, I'm going to show you two different ways of looking at the same thing. When you put together a development budget and you do a sources and uses statement, you ultimately share it with people, right? So, I was working with Cadena. We sold our company to Florida East Coast Industries, and we got into a situation where our development people wanted to kick off, they wanted to do two industrial buildings in Medley at what was called Flagler Station. So curiously, what I'm going to show you is our guys in Jacksonville took a look at the buildings and modeled the way they would do their investment company books, and then our development people here did it the way they did it. Same thing at the end of the day, but we ultimately came up with this project summary, right? And you know, ultimately we're building 172,000 square feet, we're building it on 9 acres, okay? And it's going to cost us, $11 million, or $68 a square foot. Forget this for a second, okay? I just think, okay? 68 feet. And so basically we've got a whole bunch of different concepts, right? Land prep, design, construction, and so on down. Marketing, and so on down, okay? So where are these numbers coming from? Where do these numbers come from? Your development manager, your project manager, where do the numbers come from?
Industry knowledge, some of it.
Well, you're probably going out there and calling an architect. You're calling your engineers, or you're getting a lump sum contract from your architect, which includes engineering fees and, you know, planning and all that stuff. Construction, you got a construction company, yeah, it might be your database, but it's most likely, maybe your first go of this stuff, maybe your first go around on a conceptual basis is all your industry knowledge, okay? But eventually, as you're finalizing this, you really need to get into like nitty gritty. You got to price all this stuff out, okay? Because that's really what you need to go on there and model, right? So, so while this bit is accumulation and is relatively easy to come up with, right? Ultimately, what's going to drive this is, you know, you're gonna want to, you know, model that out. Now, the kind of curious thing, and The kind of curious thing in this was that Florida East Coast had a lot of capital. The railroad we own generated a lot of cash, so these guys didn't really worry about sources and uses that much. They really were much more concerned with sort of two phases. What's it going to cost me to build? And then once it's built, what's the cash flow that that's going to be generating? As merchant developers, we're a little bit more sort of focused on what happens afterwards. So, kind of curiously, we were at $60 a square foot. These guys were at 68. They were using different assumptions on fees, on land costs, things like that. So, but this is just again, people present information in different ways. So this is one way, but you ultimately get into return information. Okay, we had a rent up period. There was a deficit. Okay, I would want to show you a different one, which is a better example of a sources and uses. This was a multifamily project we were going to build in Kendall, which we wound up never building, but uses, sources. Months, okay? How much equity is coming in, and then eventually a construction line was kicking in, some mezz financing was coming in, okay, unit sales were coming in, okay, so ultimately saying it all sort of adds this way. Now,
These, in that right there, President, why are there no, I guess because land loan papers and construction loans, those are all annually paid? Is that why you don't see any monthly costs?
Land loan.
Uses of cash? Yeah, right, okay, there's one.
these are all sources of cash. You borrowed 10 million here.
No, I mean, I'm sorry, I mean above, uses of cash, so you only use the cash annually for land loan repayment?
I'm
construction
trying to
loan?
remember this particular project. You bought the land here,
Oh, I see,
okay? And listen, this particular project, there were a lot of reasons why we never did this. There were some funky, we had like a partner here, we were gonna pay him off for the land at a certain point. What's probably kind of easier to take a look at is I sent around with a case study that we were going to do, one that was a much smaller so like oh, you want to see the suggested answers?
You said that to us?
Yeah, I might as well. Hold on. Why
Was she there when
would I-
Spalding asked that to Werther? When Chris Spalding asked that same question to Werther, it was a 20-minute discussion on academic integrity.
So this is
It was great.
This is a small project, and I sent this around, so you've got this, okay? So you can see this was actually, and I played around with the numbers a little bit, but this was basically the headquarter building that we built. It's a very expensive office. I mean, I go through all this in the video, so if you really want to watch it in detail, you can. But it was a relatively short construction or development period, and so again, the totals come across this way. There's an odd thing here. There's no land here. There's always land, and there was land here. There was a huge fight I had. The owner's perspective was that the land was being paid. We bought a parcel of land, and then he put in his mind all the land cost on the thing next door that we were, building for somebody else. So he didn't want to look. He didn't want to see land costs. So since he paid the bill, you don't want to see land costs? We want to show you land costs. Obviously, there's land costs there. So typically, land is the very first, one of the items. But as you can see, construction was a single, single biggest item there. That was funded with a construction loan. As you can see, there was some construction financing that would be, kicking in as the loan was being drawn down on. Okay, and we had no mezzanine debt here, but we had some equity that we were putting in, and then we were borrowing money as it was needed along the way. Okay, so this would be the original budget, right? So again, where do you gather that from? You gather that from your suppliers. Initial go around, You may have your own databases, you know, so you're gonna have various iterations of this, but when you're starting to get real on this, you know, you've already by this point, hopefully, gotten hard numbers from architects and all of your other suppliers. You've already gone out there and gotten at least some indication from 2 or 3 construction companies that you're comfortable with, have good databases on the kind of products that you're trying to develop. This would be, you know, this would be a potential, you know, first loan draw request. Now, when I was building this case study, I always had the doubt, you know, there's forms for everything. So construction draws are pretty standard in the industry. You use the AIA forms. You always see the AIA forms. So if you're a developer and a contractor sends you a bill, he's going to send you a, you know, the G702. It's going to send you that. If you're a developer and you want a bank to fund you, you know, what do you send them? And so I called a bunch of bankers and they're like, you know, whatever the client sends, you know, I mean, as long as the backup information's there. But typically what they're going to want to see is the original budget that was approved by the bank, and then they're going to want to see some sort of cost to date, okay? And along those lines, banks and loans may allow you to transfer dollars from one line item to another or not. They might allow you to take contingency and use it in particular line items, okay? But typically they're going to want to see what the original was that I just showed you, and then they're going to want to see some sort of month-to-month, right? And ultimately, you're going to be asking for a certain amount, okay? Where does that amount come from? Well, the contractor would typically send you his G701, or I'm sorry, G702 or G703. And I again also sent a couple of spreadsheets out so you wouldn't have to replicate these because these are difficult to produce, but this is a standard form, it's an AIA form, and it's kind of cumulative in you know, you've got the contract total and then you do it cumulatively. In month 2, you've got the cumulative billings and then you subtract any billings up to date, okay? And so we had agreed on a contract of 100,000, there were change, I mean 10,300,000, there were change orders. I'm just, you know, did this hypothetically, okay? So much is completed and stored, so much is retained, okay? So this is the net amount that needs to be paid, and that's the $1,023,000 that the developer would then request from the bank on a bank loan. Yes, sir?
Can you explain retainage better? I kind of understand who would benefit, but just in practice.
So retainage is a concept that's designed to benefit the owner, to protect the owner from a construction company or GC that would either not complete the work or have deficiencies in his work that would have to be corrected at the end of a project. So by common practice, but ultimately whatever you agreed to, by common practice, a developer would withhold or retain 10% of a contract from the payments that are made to the contractor in order to be protected that the project is going to be completed or to correct any deficiencies that the GC is not going to come up with. Does that make sense?
In the form of reduced loan draws or in the form of the full loan draw with it put aside?
I mean, that's irrelevant, really. I'll answer your question, but that's irrelevant.
I ask a lot of those questions now.
No, I understand that, but the question is, I think your question is vis-a-vis, you're not paying the GC. Now, you're asking me a very intelligent question, which is a different question, which is, well, is the bank going to fund me retainage and let me play with that money?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
I've asked that question. Most lenders will not fund retainage because ultimately they're the ones that are at risk, so they'll hold it. To the extent that they do fund it, the question that I would ask you is why do you want retainage funded? Why are you going to borrow money if you don't need it?
So they can facilitate the retainage, they can hold the money, you won't have access to it.
They typically, again, my experience would be most lenders, now, we typically pulled it, okay, now.
Of course, that's great.
We typically pulled it, but I think most lenders I've spoken with would typically withhold it. And I, you know, again, it's what you negotiate, but I think from a pragmatic perspective, if you're not gonna pay the GC retainage, most banks are not gonna give it to you. It's gonna be part of the loan, and they will eventually fund it when you pay the retainage at the end, but they typically won't fund it month to month. Okay, does that answer all of the questions?
And yeah, it's my first time I've ever heard the term, so
Okay.
glad I had a good
All right.
question.
So, the contractor certifies it and notarizes it. You typically get the architect to sign off on it. The architect comes and does their inspection and agrees to it. In a lot of cases, you'll have some sort of other third-party review. Either the bank or the owner is going to have some rep there that's also going to be on site or making periodic visits on site to make sure that in fact, because the risk that you run into is you're paying, but how do you know that that work was, your 10% of the work done, right? So in this particular case, 10% of the job's been billed, has 10% of the work actually been done. And from a pragmatic perspective, what you run into is, in order to meet these cycles that I spoke about, subs are going to bill before the work's complete, and GCs are going to bill before the work's complete. So somebody's got to be there saying, okay, they're going to get there by by the end of the month. Okay.
Yeah.
How do you quantify 10%? Is it by time?
Yeah, if it's by cost, then it is 10%.
No, I said 10% only because it's 1 million out of 10. That's how I came up with 10.
Well, I mean the 10% of the completion of work.
The retain. No, I said because 1 million in this particular case, 1 million was billed and 10 million was a contract. That's how I came up with 10%. But it could have been 3 million.
You said they pay for 10%, but how do you know if 10% of the work is done?
No.
Well, how do you quantify 10%?
Well, you got the contractor certifying that, you've got an architect reviewing it, and you're typically going to have a third-party owner's rep that's going to be, certifying that as well. And you're sending pictures along with this, and it doesn't just happen,
You go to the work site.
You go to the work site. If you're just a lender somewhere else, you're going to rely on a third party's report, not only on the architect and the GC. You're going to rely and the developer. You're going to rely on a third. Because you're also either going to tour the site or you're going to look at pictures too to get a sense that you're not going to know if it's 10% or 12%.
If you have all your materials on site, wouldn't a lot more percentage, all the hard cost supplies on
Well,
site?
that's why it doesn't. The 10% I use right now, it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
It's just at any given point in time, what you're trying to get the sense is that what's been billed has some correlation with the work that's been done. Okay, and so that G702 is typically backed by a G703. I mean, these things are thick ass paper. And so that G703 then kind of goes to a schedule of values, okay? And you've got your contract amount. This is essentially, kind of for construction, the equivalent of what the development budget is, so to speak, and it just breaks down into, and that goes, there's like all kinds of ways of classifying this. I mean, this goes above my pay grade, there are industry books that sort of track different type things, and so you tend to actually do your lines, based upon industry codes. And I mean, our particular case, I don't know how they originally set it up, but all of our books, all of our projects, all had the same sort of structure associated with them. So any PM could transition from one job to another, and know that electrical were all the hundreds or whatever, so, or 300s or whatever. So, and then what's completed, typically you're getting invoices that are coming from the subs, right? So I don't know if I didn't put any here, but, and I don't have it with me, but at one point I used to carry around with, you could see it would just be really thick. You could have hundreds of invoices coming in from subs, summarized on a 703, brought up to 702, and then that going to the developer. And you typically, going back to, there's no specific form, but going back to the first thing that I did, you're typically going to send a letter to your friendly banker, saying, look, here's a development budget, here's my loan draw request, and here's a certified application for payment coming from the from the general contractor supporting all of that, okay? We're requesting that you pay that. In this particular case, I set up a change order, we transferred as permitted from contingency to, yes, ma'am?
With the retainage, are you going to when you send in your payment, are you sending in your payment amount to include the retainage, or are you minusing it out when you put forth to the bank?
Good question.
I think it goes back to the question that we have. If the bank is going, you're gonna send the entire G702, but the bank's only gonna fund whatever you've agreed.
Because they already have I've
so-
already supplied a copy of my retainage agreement with the contractor.
No, so I'm gonna have an agreement, which again is typically, you typically start with pretty common AIA forms. You're gonna have an agreement with the GC, your contract with the GC is gonna stipulate what retainage is, okay? They're gonna bill you based upon what you agreed with them. And so you're gonna send to the bank what was billed. If the bank's agreed to fund you the retainage and trusts you with it and you wanna borrow it, then they'll fund it. If not, they won't fund it.
And they will automatically minus off 10%, let's say 10%.
Well, I disclose this, that the actual application has a retainage.
I couldn't
excluded.
see that part, that's why I'm asking, it was like, it's not on screen. When you enlarge it, it just goes all.
So the billings were $1.1 million.
Yeah,
Retainage is 10% of completed work.
okay.
So total earned is only $1.023 million, and what you're requesting is $1.023 million.
Got it,
Right there.
okay,
Okay?
okay, got it.
And that's also summarized here, right? So retainage is flowing up from here. Okay? The only other thing I wanted to show is, there's accounting that flows all this stuff too, and so, so we use cost accounting to accumulate costs, right? So it could be a construction company that keeps its costs. I did a very simple balance sheet as a developer, right? So you may see on a developer's balance sheet just one line item that says development and process, but just like we have subledgers for receivables and inventory and payables, we're going to have some sort of subledger for development and process. So it could look something like, and again, these are very simple, that whole $25 million or $250 million that we have in development may be broken down into 5 different projects, okay? And those projects we may group on a top level summary, land, A&E, hard permits, and then other. So we've got a total, right? So at any given point in time, we would know how much land we have, how much we've invested in, in soft costs, how much in hard costs, and how much in other. But then each one of the projects would have its own detailed subledger, right? So, in this particular case, we had, I don't know if you can see it, $21,900,000, right? So that $21,900,000 is the first project, right? Sunny Palms or whatever, right? Sunny Palms Development, project number 1, and then you can actually drill down on that and see that was it one land purchase, and you ultimately could go right down to like the voucher, right? Let me just blow this up a little bit, So typically somewhere along the way, you're going to be able to get cost accounting is going to let you get